Hi everyone, welcome to another video on Paranormal M. Thanks for being here with me tonight. Before we start, if you enjoy the stories in this video, please give it a like. And if you've ever had a paranormal experience you still can't explain, feel free to send it to me. Tonight's story begins with a family home being rebuilt, but once they moved back in, something about the place just didn't feel right anymore. It's the kind of story that slowly gets under your skin. So get cozy, listen closely, and I hope you sleep well after tonight's video. I want to tell you about something that still unsettles me, even now. This happened about 4 years ago, when the house I grew up in was being rebuilt from the ground up. It was an old place, close to 40 years old. And aside from a few cheap touch-ups over the years, it had never really been properly repaired. My family life was never especially happy. My parents had their struggles, and the four of us were living with my grandparents too, so the house was always crowded with tension. The one person who somehow kept everything from falling apart was my mother. When she left, everything changed, and I do not just mean emotionally. The whole house felt different. It was as if whatever warmth had lived there went with her. You know how some places feel alive, even when they are messy or imperfect. After she was gone, that feeling disappeared. It stopped feeling like a home and became just a building. Maybe that was grief talking. Maybe I simply missed her more than I understood at the time. But the change felt real. The rebuilding began not long after. It was the middle of summer, and while the construction was going on, we rented a tiny one-room place nearby. The upper floor of the house was finished first because it was meant more for practical living than for appearances. So we moved into that top floor while the ground level was still under construction. I remember how dull it felt. The walls were painted in these cold, washed-out shades of blue-gray, and the whole floor had this strange emptiness to it. I kept myself busy during the day. I have always had a million hobbies and little obsessions, so between school and my own interests, I did not think too much about the atmosphere. But nighttime was different. Every night, this heavy sense of dread would settle over me. I had experienced sleep paralysis before, so it was not something completely new. But after moving back into that rebuilt house, it became much worse, more frequent, more intense. I would wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. It felt like something was pressing down on my chest. Not just pressure, but presence. Like something was there with me, and I wanted it gone. When I finally managed to open my eyes, I would be gasping, terrified, soaked in panic. I got used to it in the way people get used to bad weather, but I never stopped fearing it. Then, about a week after we moved in, something else started. One night, I was awake later than usual, maybe around 11:30. That was when I heard it for the first time. A scream. It was distant, but clear enough to make my whole body go cold. What frightened me most was not that it sounded pained. It did not. It was almost worse than that. It sounded empty, like someone was screaming out of habit, or for no reason at all. The sound came at fixed intervals, again and again, every 10 seconds or so, always the same pitch, always the same length. There was something mechanical about the pattern, but the voice sounded like a woman's. It went on for hours that night, until around 2:30 in the morning. I barely slept. The next night it happened again. Same timing, same rhythm, same eerie repetition. And then again the night after that. Soon I could almost picture where it was coming from without even looking. Behind our house, there was a narrow alley between two residential buildings. It was the kind of shortcut most people avoided, usually occupied by drunks or men you would rather not pass alone. I had hardly ever walked through it myself, but in my mind, that was where the sound came from. I could feel it. That alley was visible from the balcony connected to my father's room, but the screaming kept happening, And then one night, everything changed. It was hotter than usual, and I could not sleep. I got up for water and found my father awake in his room, sitting with his phone in his hand like he often did when his insomnia was bad. The balcony door was wide open because the night air, even warm, felt better than the heat trapped inside. I asked him if he wanted some water too. He took the bottle, drank a little, and set it aside. Then he looked toward the balcony and said, very calmly, "Can you see her too?" I still remember how those words made my stomach drop. He pointed toward the alley, and there she was. A woman standing under the streetlight. She was wearing red, or maybe dark crimson, something deep and unmistakable in that pale light. She was completely still, not shifting her weight, not turning her head, not fidgeting, nothing. Her arms hung straight at her sides, and she was facing directly toward our balcony. I could not make out her face. I could not tell you anything about her expression. But I knew she was looking at us, or at least in our direction. I froze. I did not speak. My mind just emptied out. All I could do was stare. And then, strangely, that was the end of it. After the housewarming ceremony, the screams stopped. Just like that. No more sound in the night. No more woman in the alley. I never saw her again, and I am deeply grateful for that. But even now, when I think about that house, that rebuilt upper floor, those nights of dread, and that figure in red under the streetlight, I still feel the same chill creeping up my spine. I cannot explain what happened. I only know that it did. So this happened about 4 years ago, during the COVID period, when I was hosting a live call-in psychic show. I worked alongside a medium and the show's sponsor, and most broadcasts ran for a couple of hours with plenty of callers and guests. But honestly, this story is not really about the show itself. It is about a place. The sponsor had arranged for us to film at Coombe Abbey near Coventry in England. Because of the restrictions at the time, we were not allowed inside the building, but we did get permission to film outside. I remember being driven there by the sponsor, and it was also my first time meeting the psychic in person. I was nervous, more than I wanted to admit. You never quite know what someone like that is seeing, sensing, or quietly thinking, and that played on my mind a little. We arrived in the early afternoon, around 2 o'clock, on a bright day in late spring. The weather was beautiful, calm and sunny, and everything felt pretty normal at first. We had only been there about 10 minutes, setting up the camera and getting ready, when the sponsor suddenly called out to me and told me to look up at one of the windows. When I did, I saw her. There was a woman standing in the window. She looked like she belonged to another time, almost Edwardian or Victorian in appearance, and she was moving back and forth in a way that made it seem as though she was opening and closing curtains. But what made it so unsettling was that she was transparent. Not vague, not imagined, not a trick of the light. Transparent. Exactly the kind of ghostly figure people describe in films, except this was right there in front of me. And the strangest part was that I did not feel afraid. I had never seen anything like that before in my life, and yet I just stood there, watching. The rest of the filming went ahead, and although the atmosphere had definitely changed, we finished the shoot and headed back. On the drive home, we talked about everything that had happened, especially the woman at the window. I kept trying to make sense of it, replaying it in my head. When I got dropped off and walked toward my front door, my security light flicked on, and that is when I saw something else. A shadow figure. It was there for only a moment, but I saw it clearly enough. It moved away from me and disappeared around the corner of the house. I cannot fully explain why, but in that instant, I felt certain that something had followed me home. I had heard people use the word attachment before, and that was the first time I really thought I understood what they meant. I did not know exactly what it was, only that it did not feel right. After that, little by little, things in my life began to unravel. At first, it was smaller things: falling outs, bad luck, tension where there had not been any before. I spoke to the psychic who had been there with us and told him what I had seen, but he did not seem too concerned. Maybe he genuinely did not think it was serious, but that never really settled my mind. Then the problems kept building. Over the next few years, it felt like one thing after another. I got banned from a pub I had been going to for years over something petty and ridiculous. I had an argument with a close friend and damaged the trust between us. Then more things followed, and worse ones. Relationships broke down. Money disappeared. I lost stability, then security, then eventually my home. In the last year especially, it has felt relentless. Like every direction I turn, there is another setback, another betrayal, another blow. I have been scammed, let down, and worn down to the point where I have honestly started wondering whether I am cursed. Maybe I am searching for answers because I am exhausted. Maybe I am trying to connect dots that were never really connected. But when you have been through enough hurt, enough loss, enough chaos, you start to question everything. And that is where I am now. I am not feeling very steady, not very focused, and I honestly do not know what to make of any of it. But I know what I saw, and I know how much changed after that day. You know, some places stay with you long after you leave them. For me, it was my grandmother's family estate in rural Bangladesh. My family is originally from Bangladesh, but I was born in the US, and because my father worked as a diplomat, we were always moving from one place to another. Still, every summer, without fail, we'd go back to Bangladesh to see family. And the place I looked forward to most was this old ancestral estate on my mother's side. It was enormous. High ceilings, colored glass windows, long verandas, ponds behind the courtyard, and trees so thick they seemed to hold their own secrets. Even as a child, I could feel that the house carried history in its bones. I loved it. It felt far away from the noise of the city, almost like stepping into another world. Of course, people always had stories about that place. My relatives had their versions, and the villagers had theirs. Strange sightings, unexplained sounds, things that moved through the property at night. Back then, I treated it all like folklore. Just stories people pass down because old houses make people imaginative. Then, one summer, when I was about 11, something happened that I still cannot explain. It was very late at night. All the adults had already gone to bed, and only my 2 cousins and I were still awake. We were sitting in the courtyard, just talking quietly, enjoying the night air. Beyond the courtyard were the ponds and the woods, and usually you could hear everything: crickets, frogs, rustling leaves, the constant hum of life. Then, all at once, everything stopped. Not faded, stopped. It was so sudden that the silence itself felt loud. We all noticed it at the same time, and our conversation just died in the middle of a sentence. Before I could even make sense of it, I looked at my cousin sitting across from me and saw her face change completely. She looked terrified, absolutely frozen. I asked her what was wrong, and in this tiny whisper, she said, "There's someone behind you." I turned slightly, confused, because from where I was sitting, I couldn't see anyone behind her at all. But then the cousin beside me inhaled sharply and said the same thing, that something was there. And that's when I felt it. You know that feeling when someone is standing too close behind you, even before you see them? That pressure in the air, that instinctive awareness. The back of my neck went cold. The little hairs on my arms lifted. I felt this faint movement of air behind me, like someone large was walking very slowly past us. Then it stopped on my left side. There was this smell, too. I still remember it. Something rotten, but mixed with a strong floral scent, almost like perfume or old oil. And then something touched my hair. Not hard, just lightly, but enough. Enough that I felt it clearly. A moment later, one strand of my hair lifted, like someone had taken it between their fingers. My cousins saw it too. That was all it took. I grabbed both of them and we ran. There was a bedroom nearby where one of my great uncles was sleeping. We rushed inside, shut the door, and crawled under the bed without even waking him at first. We were shaking so badly we could barely breathe. And then we saw the shadow. From under the bed, we watched it move slowly across the floor outside the door. Then it stopped there, waiting. What unsettles me most, even now, is that all three of us saw the same thing. 2 feet outside the door. They looked like a woman's feet, but something was wrong. 1 foot faced toward the room, and the other pointed the opposite way. Even after it was gone, none of us came out right away. We stayed under that bed in complete silence until I finally reached up and shook my great uncle awake. We told him we were frightened and asked if he could take us back to the room where we were sleeping. What stayed with me almost as much as what we saw was his reaction. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss us. He just looked at us and asked, very calmly, "Did you see something?" I nodded. He got up, checked outside the door, and quietly walked us back across the estate. None of us slept that night. Not long after, the animals started. The livestock on the property suddenly began crying out all at once. The stray dogs outside started barking too. It was loud enough to wake other people in the house, and the whole atmosphere felt wrong, like something had unsettled everything living around us. After maybe 10 minutes, it all stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The next morning, we talked about what happened. I honestly expected the adults to brush it off, maybe tell us we imagined it because we were tired and scared. But that didn't happen. No one really questioned us. The caretaker simply said the animals sometimes react when they see things moving around the house, things they do not like. That sentence has never left me. My mother forbade us from staying up alone again after that, and I didn't argue. I barely slept the next couple of nights anyway. I went back to that estate once more after that trip, and nothing happened, at least not to me. Then life moved on, the way it always does. School, adulthood, distance, time. I haven't been back to Bangladesh nearly as often as I would like, but I'm planning to return this summer, and apparently the family wants to visit the estate again after all these years. And I'll be honest with you, part of me still feels like that child in the courtyard. Because it's one thing to hear stories. It's one thing to doubt them, explain them away, tuck them into the folder labeled folklore. It's another thing entirely to feel something touch you in the dark. Okay, so I need to tell you this exactly the way it felt, because even now, I cannot shake it. A while back, my fiancé and I had to move into his parents' old farmhouse in rural Indiana after money got tight. The place sits near open land and a stretch of woods, and ever since I got here, things have felt wrong. Not in a vague, nervous way. I mean, I've seen shapes outside the windows at night that looked like they were watching me. One evening, both my fiancé and I saw what looked like a structure at the edge of the tree line, almost like an old shed or building, and then it was just gone. And more than once, standing outside after dark, I've had this awful pull toward the woods, like something out there wanted my attention. I do have trauma, and I've had nightmares for years, so I tried to be rational about it. But those dreams had finally started fading, and then suddenly, after moving here, they came back. Only these felt different. Sharper, heavier, like they weren't just coming from me. Around the same time, I also started struggling to fall asleep until really late, which is unusual for me. The night this happened, I was heading upstairs to our room. This house has animals everywhere, so hearing paws or movement usually wouldn't mean much. But I heard something behind me that sounded like a cat, and instantly every part of me knew it was not a cat. I didn't stop to check. I ran upstairs, shut the door, and eventually fell asleep. At first, the dream was normal enough. Then it changed all at once. I was in a house that was similar to the one we live in now, but not exactly the same. My fiancé was there, his mom was there, and her service dog was there too. Except in the dream, I called her Kala instead of Callie. She's normally this big, fluffy black dog with the sweetest face. The kind of dog that looks like she was put on earth just to love people. But in the dream, something was off immediately. Everyone kept insisting she was some other animal, something ridiculous, and the more they said it, the less she looked like herself. She started following me from room to room with this awful expression, like she was waiting for the right moment to hurt me. And in the dream, I was completely certain she was going to kill me. Then a porch light went dark across the road, and my fiancé said, very matter-of-factly, that an old man had died. I remember trying to explain to him and his mom that the dog wasn't really a dog, that I knew something was wrong. And right in the middle of that, I looked outside, and there was a man standing there watching me. Just standing there. I screamed. By then, the animal beside me had changed even more. It had no fur anymore. Its skin was this strange gray-blue color, and its body was swollen and unnatural, almost like some oversized hairless creature with a flattened trunk for a snout. It stayed pressed close to me wherever I moved, staring at me the whole time. And somehow, in the middle of all of that, his mom stayed calm and told me the man outside was only there to move furniture, and that I needed to sit down, relax, and have some tea. Then we turned a corner, and this woman came in dressed in white. She looked old-fashioned, almost delicate, with short curled hair and this pale yellow-blonde color to it. She was carrying a vintage mirror cabinet, the kind that opens into little compartments, and inside were pieces of gold jewelry laid out neatly, gleaming like they wanted to be noticed. My fiancé was mesmerized by it. The woman was speaking, but it was like hearing two voices from the same mouth. One voice was clear and pleasant, explaining the cabinet and the jewelry. The other was quieter, buried underneath, almost whispering in another layer of sound. I couldn't understand it, but I also couldn't stop listening. I sat straight up and told my fiancé that it felt like something had taken over my dream. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Not just a nightmare. More like something stepped in and started arranging things. What scared me even more was his reaction. He didn't laugh it off. He told me that when he used to live there, he would sometimes see an older woman in the house, and she reminded him of the woman from my dream. He said he'd also felt watched in that house before, and that there were times he believed there were spirits there. He even said parts of what I described sounded like another house he had lived in with his parents, where a man had died, and where he always felt like someone was sitting and observing him. The only history I really know about this place is what his dad has told me. It's a very old house, built long ago by a German family who apparently never finished it. There are stories about the property, stories about people dying, about strange gatherings, about the land holding on to things. And what unsettles me is that nobody in the family seems shocked by any of this. They all act like it's just part of the house. I still don't want to go into the woods at night. During the day, maybe, but after dark, absolutely not. Recently, while walking near the outer edge in daylight, we found a pile of deer bones and the remains of some smaller animal nearby. I know there are normal explanations for that. Coyotes, other wildlife, even people. I understand that. But with everything else that's happened here, it didn't feel easy to dismiss. Usually I question myself. I talk myself down. I tell myself I'm tired, anxious, imagining things. But this has gone beyond that for me. It feels like something is reaching, or calling, or trying to make itself look harmless when it isn't. And I don't know what it wants. I just know that whatever is happening here feels real to me. And more than anything, I want to understand it before it gets any closer. I still think about this trip sometimes, and even now, it gives me chills. My husband, Aaron, and I have always loved camping. We go all year round across Ontario, no matter what the weather's doing. Rain, cold, wind, even the first snow, it never really stops us. Usually those trips are the best kind of reset for us. We cook, hike, play cards, sit by the fire, and just disappear from the world for a while. A few years back, we decided to try a smaller campground several hours north of home over the long weekend in early September. We'd learned that if you stay a little past the holiday itself, the place usually empties out fast once families head back for work and school. Sure enough, when we arrived, it was beautiful and almost deserted. There were only a few other campers scattered around. The first night, the weather turned ugly. It rained hard all night, and by the next morning, we watched the last few campers pack up and leave. After that, it was just us. Completely alone. At first, that felt kind of perfect. For the next couple of days, everything was normal. We wandered the trails, made really good food, played board games under the canopy, and enjoyed how quiet everything was. But on what ended up being our last night there, the rain came back, heavier than before. We stayed close to the site and turned in early. Before bed, we cleaned everything up properly, packed away the dishes, stored the food, all of it. Nothing was left out. By the time we zipped ourselves into the tent, thunder was cracking right overhead, and lightning was flashing so bright it lit the whole campsite through the fabric. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. The thunder had started to fade, but the lightning was still intense. Every flash lit up the tent walls so clearly that I could make out the trees, the picnic table, the edges of the site outside us. I remember lying there, half awake, watching the shadows appear and vanish. Aaron was asleep beside me, completely calm, like none of it was bothering him. And then that feeling hit me. It was this sudden, overwhelming dread. Not nervousness, not simple fear. It felt like every instinct in my body was screaming that something was wrong. I tried to move, and I couldn't. I was frozen there, staring at the tent wall, heart pounding. Then I saw movement outside. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but every time the lightning flashed, it was there again. A figure. Tall. Moving on two legs. Too tall, honestly, and wrong somehow. The shape looked almost human, but not quite. The head seemed too large, the posture too strange. I just lay there, helpless, watching it circle closer and closer to the tent door. Then it came toward us. What terrified me most was that it didn't seem to open the tent. It just came through. That's the last thing I remember before everything went black. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and Aaron was outside making breakfast like it was any other day. I was completely shaken. I told him what happened, and he brushed it off at first. He said it was probably a nightmare, maybe sleep paralysis. And to be fair, I have had sleep paralysis before, so I tried to convince myself that was all it was. But this felt different. Far more vivid. Far more real. I couldn't shake the feeling at all, and eventually he agreed we should pack up and leave that day. Months later, I brought it up again. That's when he admitted he hadn't told me the truth that morning. He said he had also woken up that same night and seen a figure moving around outside the tent. He'd thought he must have been dreaming too, so he kept it to himself because he didn't want to scare me. But when I told him I'd seen it too, it rattled him. We never checked for footprints or anything like that. With all the rain, I doubt we would have found much anyway. Later on, one of Aaron's relatives recommended another northern campground to us, near an old abandoned settlement. He and his family had just gone and thought we'd love it. While he was talking about it, his wife overheard and joined in. She said the place was beautiful, but from the moment they drove in, she felt like something was wrong. She couldn't explain it well, just that she felt uneasy the entire time and never wanted to go back. That stayed with me, but we went anyway. The campground had this eerie history to it. Long before settlers arrived, the land had belonged to indigenous communities. Then logging came in, a rail line was built, and for a while there had been a real town there. By the late 20th century, the railway was gone and most of the place had been left behind. To reach the campground, you had to drive through what was left of that old settlement first. A few homes were still standing, but most of it felt abandoned, like a place time had stepped away from. We arrived after dark over Thanksgiving weekend in October, after getting a little lost on the way. I will never forget that drive. The road was pitch black, and then when we finally reached our site, there was this enormous full moon hanging over the lake. It was so bright it almost didn't look real. The campground itself was quiet, sparse. Maybe one or two other campers, and they were nowhere near us. Our site was right on the water, which Aaron loved because he's happiest with a fishing rod in his hand. One morning, he came back from fishing carrying an old cast-iron pot he'd found near the shoreline. Looking back, we probably should have left it where it was, but at the time it just felt like an odd little relic from the old town, so he brought it back to camp. Later that day, we both took a nap. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. I looked over and saw Aaron wasn't beside me, so I assumed he'd gotten up already. Then I heard him yelling. Not angry exactly, more startled, alarmed. He kept saying things like, "Hey buddy, what are you doing?" And, "This is our campsite, you can't be here." I sat up, instantly tense, trying to understand what was happening. He kept calling out, asking who the person was and why they were there. Then after a few minutes, he came into the tent looking completely shaken and told me a man had wandered onto our site. He said the man was dressed strangely for the weather, no proper coat, no boots, even though it was freezing cold and had already been snowing off and on that weekend. According to Aaron, the man didn't respond to him at all. He just walked straight toward the water and stepped in, like he was searching for something. Aaron kept talking to him, trying to get his attention, but the man acted like he wasn't even there. Then the man turned and walked away. Aaron told me he was going to follow at a distance, just to make sure it wasn't some lost camper who needed help. He was gone maybe 10 minutes, maybe a little more. When he came back, he looked pale. He said he couldn't find anyone. There were a few sites behind ours, but they were empty. No cars, no voices, no sign that anyone had come through. Just nothing. We both stood there trying to make sense of it, and neither of us could. To this day, I don't know what we experienced on those trips. Maybe there's a logical explanation. Maybe fear, weather, isolation, old places, and darkness can do strange things to the mind. But I also can't ignore the fact that both of us saw things, separately, without knowing the other had seen them too. And with that second campground especially, with all that history sitting quietly under the surface, part of me still wonders whether we crossed paths with something that never really left. Honestly, I'm not sure which possibility is more unsettling. I want to tell you about something that's been weighing on me for a while, because honestly, I still don't know what to make of it. I'm 22, and I live with my fiancé Ryan in a tiny countryside town in Ireland. We moved into this old house in early autumn last year, and from the moment we settled in, things just started to feel off. Not all at once, not in some dramatic movie kind of way, but in little unsettling moments that slowly built into something harder to ignore. The house itself is very old, built sometime in the 1800s, and it's protected because of its history, so a lot of the original front windows and stonework are still there. It has 2 floors, 3 bedrooms, and this heavy, still feeling that's hard to explain unless you've been in a place like that. I never learned much for certain about its past, but people around town have said it may once have belonged to someone who worked with the dead, and that coffins were supposedly kept there. I've never been able to prove that, so I try not to lean too much on rumors. Still, once you're living there and strange things start happening, those stories do echo in your mind a bit louder. At the beginning, it was just me and Ryan in the house. We hadn't adopted our cats yet. One evening, maybe only a few weeks after moving in, I was home alone while he was out training. I was sitting on the sofa in the living room, half watching television, half winding down from the day. The way the house is laid out, the living room opens straight into the hallway, and from there you can see the stairs and the doors leading off to the kitchen and bathroom. We usually leave that door open because it's easier. It was dark outside by then, and I'm one of those people who hates wasting electricity, so the hallway light was off. I remember glancing toward the doorway because I caught movement in the corner of my eye. When I turned properly, I saw what looked like the outline of a head just barely leaning into view from the hallway, like someone was peeking in at me. What chilled me was the height of it. It was far too high up to make sense, higher than where anyone's head should have been. I just stared for a second because my brain genuinely couldn't catch up with what I was seeing. Then I looked away, almost instinctively, like if I broke eye contact it might stop being real. When I looked back, it was gone. I can still remember the cold rush that went through me. I felt completely stuck, like I couldn't even trust myself enough to move. I stayed right where I was until Ryan got home. When I told him, he tried to reassure me and said I was probably just spooked from being alone in an unfamiliar old house. And maybe that would have made sense if it had stopped there, but it didn't. After that, things seemed to get stranger. Lights would suddenly stop working, and when we checked the breaker, it had been flipped off. Doors would move on their own, especially our bedroom door late at night. We'd hear sudden thuds from downstairs, the kind that make you freeze and listen. More than once, I heard what sounded exactly like footsteps coming up the stairs, then along the hallway, and stopping right outside our bedroom door. Those were the moments that really got to me. That feeling of something coming closer, then just waiting outside. At first, I kept trying to explain it all away. Old house noises, bad wiring, drafts, floorboards settling. I wanted there to be a reasonable answer so badly. But then our cats came into the picture, and that changed things for me a little. These days, I feel watched in that house far more often than I'd like to admit. Not every second, not constantly, but enough that it sits in the back of my mind even when nothing is happening. That's the hardest part, really, the not knowing. I don't know whether this is all a chain of strange coincidences, whether there's some explanation we haven't found yet, or whether there's truly something in that house that doesn't want to be ignored. And I'll be honest with you, that uncertainty is what scares me most. Because if there is something there, I have no idea whether it means harm or whether it's simply there with us. I'm also afraid of doing the wrong thing, of reaching out, acknowledging it, or somehow making whatever this is feel more welcome in our lives. So that's where I'm at. I'm trying to stay rational, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't frightened. And more than anything, I just want to understand what's happening in that house. I've had things happen that my rational, science-minded brain still can't neatly explain. And honestly, that's part of why I'm sharing this with you. I'm someone who usually looks for evidence, patterns, and practical answers. But some experiences have stayed with me for years, and they don't fit cleanly into anything I can reason away. It started when I was about 11. I had this unbelievably vivid dream where I was walking through a beautiful, almost glowing garden. I came to this greenhouse, stepped inside, and there was George Harrison. We sat together for a while and talked. I don't remember every word now, but I remember the feeling. It was gentle, comforting. I was telling him about the hard things going on at home, and before I left, he looked at me, told me everything was going to be all right, and gave me a hug. I woke up feeling strangely comforted and just carried on, thinking it was simply a lovely dream. Then years later, long after I'd forgotten about it, I came across a photo of a garden that stopped me cold. It was the exact garden from that dream. Same feeling, same layout, same details. I looked into it more and realized it was the garden at Friar Park, George Harrison's estate. And the strange part is, as a kid, I had absolutely no reason to know that place even existed. But somehow, in that dream, I had been there. Another moment that still shakes me happened when I was home from college, spending time with friends. Right before I left, I had this sudden, completely out of nowhere urge to say something odd to one of my closest friends, whom I'll call Allie. I told her, "I never want to get a phone call about you dying." It was such a weird thing to say, so unlike me, and she just laughed it off. She told me not to worry, that nothing like that was going to happen. About 6 months later, I was at work and randomly brought up Allie's name to a coworker. There was no reason for it. It just came out. Less than 10 minutes later, my then fiancé, Martin, called me and told me she had died. I still remember the shock of that moment. It felt like the ground disappeared underneath me. Martin and I eventually broke up because of his addiction. It wasn't angry or cruel. I still cared about him deeply, but I couldn't stand by and watch him slowly destroy himself. We went our separate ways, and life kept moving. Then, in December 2022, he passed away from an overdose. The summer before he died, one of his best friends, Tyler, who had died years earlier, showed up in a dream. The whole thing had this heavy, unsettling feeling, like he was trying to warn me about something I couldn't yet see. After that dream, I started noticing reminders of him everywhere. Songs, old photos, certain clothes, random videos. Things tied to him kept appearing in my life in ways that felt too pointed to ignore. Then after Martin died, all of it stopped almost instantly. And it isn't only dreams. After my grandmother died, I was in that half-awake, half-asleep space one night, and I heard her laugh. Clear as day. Not faint, not imagined in some vague way. It sounded real enough that it brought me to tears. So that's the pattern I keep coming back to. Dreams. That in-between state of sleep and waking. Sudden intuitions about death. Details that later turn out to be true, even when I had no obvious way of knowing them. I've had many more experiences than these, but these are the ones that stay brightest in my mind. I still try to live my life logically. I still believe in questioning things, in being grounded, in not jumping to conclusions. But I can't pretend these moments haven't happened. They have. And they've left me with more questions than answers. I don't know what any of it means. I really don't. But I'd be grateful to hear whether you've ever gone through anything like this too. You know, I've had a few experiences over the years that still sit in the back of my mind because I've never quite known what to make of them. The first one happened when I was really little, maybe around 5. I was in my parents' bedroom in the middle of the day, just watching a Garfield cartoon on TV. I wasn't sleepy or anything, and everything felt completely normal at first. Then, out of nowhere, I got this strong feeling that something frightening was about to appear on the screen. It was so sudden that I turned away and shut my eyes. But here's the weird part. Even with my eyes closed, I somehow still felt like I could see what was happening on the TV. And I saw this huge purple octopus. I don't remember hearing anything that should have tipped me off. So when I looked back at the screen and saw that same octopus there, it really startled me. In the end, it actually wasn't scary at all, which almost made it stranger. I remember telling my mom about it, and I don't think she really believed me. It never happened again, not once. Another thing I remember from childhood is that up until I was maybe 7 or 8, I would sometimes hear voices very briefly. Sometimes it sounded like a man, sometimes a woman, but never anyone I recognized. Usually it was just one voice at a time, though once or twice it almost seemed like two people were speaking back and forth. What stood out was how real it sounded, like the voices were actually in the room and not just in my thoughts. The strangest part was that in the exact moment it happened, I felt like I understood what they were saying. But the second it stopped, it was like the meaning disappeared too, and I couldn't recall a single word. It would only last a split second, and I was usually alone when it happened. It hasn't happened since I was a kid, so I've always wondered whether it was just one of those odd things that can happen when you're young and your mind is still developing. There was also this other thing from when I was a kid that I didn't think much about until I got older. At night, I'd sometimes notice what looked like cat eyes in the reflection of windows. Usually this happened when lights were on inside, though I think I may have noticed it in daylight once or twice too. I never owned a cat, and sometimes I'd see them reflected in upstairs windows, which made even less sense. They always looked too close, almost warped somehow, not like they could belong to an actual animal outside. Back then, I mostly brushed it off and figured it was just the reflection catching in a strange way. But the reason it stayed with me is that I stopped seeing them as I got older. That made me look back on it differently. Maybe it really was just childhood imagination, or maybe my eyes and brain were interpreting things in a way they no longer do now. Then there's the most recent one, from maybe a few years ago. I was sitting in bed at night, looking out at the stars, when I noticed one of them moving. At first, I assumed it had to be a plane, but it didn't blink, and it looked exactly like all the other stars around it. It moved slowly and steadily in a straight line, and then it seemed to line up with another star and just disappear. Every night, the last walk with my dog happens pretty late, usually sometime between about midnight and 2:30 in the morning, depending on how the day has gone. It's always just me and my dog, Rusty, out on this completely quiet street, with maybe one car passing every now and then. This happened a couple of years ago. It was during one of those final walks, and I remember it being a little after 1:30 a.m. Rusty had just finished doing his business, and we turned around to head back home. That's when I suddenly got this powerful feeling that someone was watching us. You know that feeling that hits before you even understand why? It was exactly that. As we walked past a couple of parked cars on our side of the street, my view opened up toward the house across from ours. And that's when I saw him. There was this very tall figure just standing there, facing us, a few feet behind the neighbor's pickup truck. At first, I thought it might be the man who lived there, because he was tall too. But even then, something about it felt wrong. As we got closer, I could tell it wasn't him at all. This figure was taller, much thinner, almost unnaturally lean. Our neighbor was broad and solidly built. This was different. Then I noticed something that sent this cold jolt through me. There's a streetlight near our yard that lights up everything around it. Our driveway, the sidewalk, the neighbor's yard, even the front of their house. It all gets washed in that light. But this figure didn't. It wasn't lit at all. I'd seen people out walking late before, and at that spot on the street, nobody ever stayed in shadow. But this thing did. And the closer I got, the stranger it looked. It was almost like it wasn't just standing in darkness. It was pulling the light into itself. That's the only way I can describe it. It looked darker than any shadow around it, darker than it should have been. It never moved, not once. But somehow, the way it stood there made it obvious it was watching me. And the feeling I had only got stronger the closer I came. It felt threatening, deeply threatening. Normally, I would have kept walking straight to our driveway before turning in, but that would have put me directly across the street from it. I couldn't do that. So instead, I cut up the next door neighbor's driveway and crossed through our yard just to put more space between us. Even then, it still felt too close. I kept glancing back over my shoulder while I unlocked the front door, and the whole time it stayed exactly where it was, just watching. Once I got inside, I tried to tell myself it had to be some kind of trick of the light. I really wanted to believe that. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Not really. And ever since then, every single night when I take Rusty out for that last walk, I look at that exact same spot. Part of me keeps hoping I'll see it again, because maybe then I could force myself to get closer and prove there's some normal explanation. But it's never happened again. And honestly, after all this time, it's getting harder and harder to pretend it was nothing. I truly believe that something or someone was out there watching us that night. When I was around 9, I lived in a very remote part of Suriname. Most of the country felt wild and open, with one main city and then long stretches of countryside and rainforest. We were in one of those quiet places, the kind where you could stand outside and hear almost nothing except wind, insects, and your own thoughts. Our nearest neighbor was across from us, and after that, the next house was so far away it barely felt like a neighborhood at all. Our home sat right beside the rainforest, along a dirt road that didn't lead anywhere useful. There was no store, no school, no reason for strangers to pass by. Just trees, brush, red dirt, and the same familiar silence every day. We didn't have a TV, so my brothers, sisters, and I made our own fun. We read whatever books we could find, rode our bikes up and down the road, and played outside until the light started fading. That was just life for us. Quiet, predictable, almost sealed off from the rest of the world. I should probably mention something about myself because this part matters. When I was a child, strange things happened around me from time to time. Not constantly, but enough that I couldn't pretend it was my imagination. I'd feel my hair tugged when no one was near me. Sometimes I'd wake up with scratches on my legs. Once in a while, I'd hear whispering so close it felt like someone was standing right behind me. Even now, as an adult, rare things still happen. I never went looking for any of it. I just learned to live with it. But what happened that day felt different. I was outside watching our dogs messing around in the yard when I noticed a man jogging past our house. He was white, dressed in running clothes, maybe a pale shirt and shorts, moving at a steady pace down that dirt road. I had never seen him before. That alone was strange. Nobody used that road unless they lived there, and we all knew each other. My neighbors were Indian, older, quiet, and kept to themselves. There was no one else around. What struck me immediately was that the dogs didn't react. These were guard dogs. They barked at everything. A bird landing too hard on a branch could set them off. But this man passed right by, and they didn't make a sound. They didn't even seem to notice him. I asked my mother about him, and she looked confused. She said she hadn't seen anyone. I remember trying to explain it, telling her he had just run past the house, but she brushed it off because there was no one there by then. I let it go. Then a few days later, I saw him again. Same road. Same steady jog. Same silence. This time, without even thinking it through, I grabbed my bike and followed him. That part still unsettles me, even now. It wasn't curiosity, not really. I didn't feel brave or playful or even reckless. It was more like a pull. A quiet command in the back of my mind telling me to keep going. I didn't call for my mother. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, which was unusual for me. I just got on my bike and trailed behind him. I stayed maybe 10 or 12 feet back, and the whole time I heard nothing. That road was dry and rough. If someone ran on it, you'd hear the crunch of dirt and gravel under their feet. If I coasted too fast on my bike, I could hear my own tires grinding against the road. But from him, nothing. Not one footstep. Not one breath. Nothing. He never looked back at me either. He had to know I was there. I was right behind him, close enough that any normal person would have turned around at least once. But he didn't. He just kept moving forward, calm and steady, like I wasn't even worth acknowledging. Every sensible part of me should have turned around. I should have stopped right there and gone home. But I didn't. He ran straight off the road and into the grass. And even then, there was no sound. No swish of grass brushing against his legs. No crackle. No bending stems. Barely any movement at all, as if the grass didn't know he was passing through it. That was the moment something inside me finally started to panic. I got off my bike and stood there staring. He was moving toward the trees, and I was just about to step forward and follow him into that field when, from my left side, I heard my mother's voice as clearly as I've ever heard anything in my life. "Maisie!" Loud, sharp, real. I turned immediately and answered, "What?" But there was no one there. No mother, no person, no movement behind me, just empty road and still air. I spun back around toward the trees. The man was gone, completely gone. There was nowhere he could have disappeared to that quickly. No path, no opening, no sound, no sign of anything moving ahead of me. 1 second he was there, and the next second I was alone. I felt this cold rush go through my whole body, like something deep inside me had finally woken up and realized I was in danger. I jumped back on my bike and rode home as fast as I could, barely breathing. When I got there, my mother was inside cooking. She had never left the house, and I never saw that man again. To this day, I do not believe he was human. I believe something lured me down that road. I believe I was being drawn away on purpose, almost like I'd fallen under a spell for those few minutes. And whatever called me back, whatever used my mother's voice to stop me from taking that next step, saved me. Years later, I spoke with a psychic medium who told me there was an older female spirit watching over me, some kind of guardian. I don't know what to make of that. I can't say for certain who or what protected me that day. Maybe it was a spirit. Maybe it was something I'll never understand. All I know is this. Something wanted me to keep following that runner into the trees, and something else made sure I didn't. And I have never stopped being grateful for that. You know, my parents sold my childhood home a few years ago and bought this older house that had originally been built by a husband and wife back in the late 1960s. As far as we know, that couple were the only people who had ever lived there before my parents. The wife passed away sometime in the 2010s, and her husband died in 2022. Not long after that, the house was sold to my parents. We really did not know much else about them. When we first got the place, it felt like stepping into a time capsule. So much of it still had that old 1970s look and charm. My parents love renovation projects, so they updated almost everything. Now it looks beautiful, fresh, and bright, but it still has this quiet personality from the original home that we never wanted to erase. Before we fully moved in, we brought our dog over a few times. Her name is Maisie, and she is fearless. Seriously, nothing rattles her. Loud storms, fireworks, strange noises, none of it bothers her. But one day, I was walking through the house with my brother and Maisie, just looking around because I had not really explored it yet. There is a finished basement, and connected to it is this unfinished storage area with an old bathroom tucked away in the back. The second we got near that space, Maisie completely changed. She started barking, whining, and refusing to go any farther. She would only wait on the stairs for us to come back up. She acted the exact same way around the old shed at the far end of the yard. At first, I laughed it off because dogs can be weird sometimes. But after a while, it did start to stick with me. At the time, I was still in school, so I spent a lot of hours sitting at the desk in the corner of my room. Over and over again, I would catch this faint smell drifting through the room, like an old floral perfume. It would come in so suddenly, almost like it had slipped in through a crack somewhere, and then vanish just as fast. It was never anything my mom or I owned, and it definitely was not the kind of scent either of us would wear. We both hate heavy floral perfumes. But the strange part is, it never felt unsettling. Every time I noticed it, I felt calm, safe even. Then today, my mom and I were talking with one of her friends, and somehow the conversation drifted into paranormal stories. I am really interested in that kind of thing, but my mom usually is not. She is more of a polite listener than a believer. But while we were talking, she brought up something she had never really made a big deal out of before. She said that one night she woke up and saw an elderly woman sitting at the edge of her bed. The woman had short white hair and was holding a small white dog in her lap. And what really stood out to me was that my mom said she did not feel afraid at all. Not even for a second. She just felt oddly at peace. When she said that, I immediately thought about the perfume because it sounded like the same kind of presence. Gentle, familiar somehow, not frightening. The next morning, my mom told my dad what she had seen. They knew the last name of the couple who had built the house, so they looked up their obituaries. They had never seen a photo of them before, but the very first picture my dad found showed the same older woman, with the same short white hair, holding the same little white dog my mom had described. I do not know if it was my sleep schedule or something deeper, but when I woke up this morning, I genuinely was not expecting the light. I still had the same thought in my head that I had fallen asleep with, and when I opened my eyes, it felt like time had skipped ahead without me, like whole hours had quietly disappeared. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just one of those ordinary feelings people have and brush off. But when I first woke up, I could not shake the sense that something had shifted. The energy in my room felt different. Not dramatic in a movie kind of way, just off, strange, unfamiliar. I remember looking around at my room, at the windows especially, like I was seeing them from a distance. I even pulled out my grimoire and started writing in it, which I have not done in a long while. I think part of me was trying to ground myself, to anchor back into something familiar. When I thought about the night before, I started piecing together a few possible reasons, though none of them came with clear answers. It is a little embarrassing to admit, but I have been playing this video game with these stylized, alluring versions of the 7 deadly sins. I had been saying some of their names out loud without really thinking much of it. Mostly Mamiel because that character stands out to me the most, but also the others too. like Lucian. I had also been thinking a lot about the game's version of hell, which feels more symbolic and layered than the terrifying version religion often paints. I tend to rationalize everything. Even when something unsettles me, like demons, spirits, or anything in that realm, I usually keep it at arm's length by thinking it through. That habit has protected me in a lot of ways. And to be honest, aside from a few unsettling experiences when I was younger, I have mostly stayed away from anything that felt too dark for the past few years. What made it stranger was the dream, or at least the fragments of it I could remember. I usually do not remember my dreams clearly, but this one stayed with me in pieces. I remember being in a cathedral, dressed as an altar girl, standing beside a close friend. Then there was a man, someone powerful, offering me weed. I still do not want to say who he reminded me of, but the feeling of it lingers. After that, I remember walking out from a stone tower passage and a priest shutting these heavy wooden doors beside me. The night before, I had also been writing about time loops and immortality. I was deep in those thoughts, really wandering through them, though that is not unusual for me. I have always been drawn to ideas like that. What gives me pause is my own history. Years ago, I learned the hard way what obsession with dark or demonic themes can do to my mind. I made a promise to myself that I would not let myself drift too far into those things again. Back in high school, I had a period where I got intensely fixated on incubi and all of that. It left a mark on me. So this morning, sitting there in bed, I started wondering whether constantly speaking certain names, thinking certain thoughts, and turning things over in my mind could somehow make them feel more real. I have never felt particularly talented at manifestation. I mean, I have tried for years with very little to show for it. So part of me keeps asking, why would anything suddenly start working now? And yet, when I woke up, I truly felt a shift. All I know is that I have not felt the energy around me change that strongly in a very long time. And maybe it does not have to mean something frightening. Maybe it is not a warning at all. Maybe it is a nudge. A sign that some part of me is waking back up. Not just toward life, but toward the more intuitive, witchy part of myself that I have let go quiet for too long. I still remember the first time I saw it. I had just stepped out of my room, heading to the bathroom like it was any other normal moment. The stairs leading up to the top floor are right there the second you walk out, so they're hard to miss. And as I was passing by, I caught sight of something moving down the stairs. At first, I just froze. It froze too. For maybe 3 seconds, we just looked at each other. I kept walking, almost like my mind refused to process what I'd just seen. But a few steps later, it hit me. I really had seen something. So I turned back and looked at the stairs again. Nothing. It had been near the very top. All I really caught was its body, completely dark, like a black shape against the stairway. And when I tried to look again, it was gone. After that, I asked my cousins if they'd ever seen anything strange in the house. They told me, not a demon, but a ghost. The thing is, I wasn't really asking about ghosts, because I already believed there were spirits in the house. So hearing that only made me feel more certain that what I saw was something darker. Our house has a long history. It's been standing since the 1970s, and it was remodeled sometime in the 1980s. Since then, so many of my relatives have lived here. My grandparents, my uncle and aunt, my cousins, all of us passing through the same rooms, the same halls, the same heavy feeling in the air. My aunt used to talk about that feeling a lot. She lives overseas now, but ever since I was younger, She said the house carries this energy that drains people. She's always been sensitive to things most people would brush off. She once tried to explain that she would sometimes leave her body in her sleep and wander without meaning to. I never knew exactly what to call that, but she believed it was real. And honestly, the older I get, the harder it is to dismiss what she said. She always believed the house held on to pain. Not just sadness, but anger too. Tension, frustration. Like the walls soaked it all in over the years and never let it go. And when you grow up hearing that, and then you start feeling it for yourself, it gets under your skin. Sometimes I catch myself wondering whether everyone who stays here ends up carrying that weight. Whether the house presses down on people until they can't really move forward. Maybe doomed is too strong a word, but it does feel like no one here has ever really had the chance to thrive. Maybe it's something spiritual. Maybe it's years of emotional wounds and untreated struggles piling up. Maybe it's both. I honestly don't know. What really scares me is that I'm not the only one who's seen something. My brother had his own encounter too. He said he saw the same figure in the bathroom. Again, completely black. That shook me because my cousins had already told me they'd felt watched there before, especially from the bathroom on the second floor. Like something was standing there, just staring. And then there are the smaller things, the ones that start out easy to dismiss until they happen too often. My brother was making noodles one night and swore he only turned on one burner on the stove. Just one. But when he came back, there were two burners on. He also noticed a wooden-handled fork sitting near the flame, even though he hadn't left it there. That kind of thing stays with you. It makes you replay every little detail, asking yourself whether you made a mistake or whether something else was there with you. So that's where I am now. I'm worried. I don't know exactly what this thing is, and I don't want to jump straight to calling it a demon, even though that's where my mind keeps going. I've heard people say demons do far worse, that they hurt people, disturb homes, and make their presence known in terrifying ways. Whatever this is, it does seem to disturb things, but in quieter ways, subtle enough that part of you still questions yourself. And maybe that's what unsettles me most. Not just what I saw, but how impossible it feels to explain it away. So this morning I got up at around 8:30, but I was still completely drained because I'd stayed up way too late the night before. I made myself a cup of tea and tried to ease into the day, but I could barely keep my eyes open. My husband and our dog were still asleep, and the whole house was so quiet that I figured I'd just lie back down for a little while. I set a couple of alarms, thinking I'd only rest for a few minutes before properly starting my day. And then, I slipped into one of the strangest dreams I've ever had. In the dream, I thought I had woken up in my bed, but right away something looked wrong. My bedside table wasn't the way it normally is at all. Instead of the usual stuff, it was covered with all these random craft things, colored pens, sketch pads, scissors, and this odd little metal tool that looked part compass, part ruler. I remember staring at it and thinking, this has to be a dream. None of this belongs here. But then I reached out and touched it, and that's what really got me. It felt completely real. The cool metal, the weight of it, the texture, all of it felt exactly the way it would in real life. I even remember telling myself, I need to remember this when I wake up. Then I really did wake up, but I was still exhausted, so I closed my eyes again. And somehow, I went straight back into the exact same dream. Same room, same bed, same strange feeling. But this time my husband was there, awake, acting totally normal. He was teasing me, being playful, leaning over me, kissing me. and it all felt so physically real that I didn't question it at first. Then I woke up again for real, opened my eyes, and just lay there for a second thinking, wait, that wasn't actually him? But I was still so sleepy that I drifted off again. And somehow, the dream picked up again, right where it had left off. Only this time, everything shifted. The energy changed. What had felt familiar suddenly felt wrong. It no longer felt like my husband at all. I started seeing this unsettling figure, something dark and distorted, almost human but not quite, and then mostly just shadows. At the same time, I could still feel this weight pressing on me, like someone was physically there. That was the moment it turned terrifying, because I realized I couldn't move. My whole body felt frozen. My eyes were so heavy, and I was fighting so hard to open them. I could actually feel my eyes trying to move underneath my eyelids, like I was forcing myself awake and getting nowhere. I started to panic a little, but I also knew enough to realize what might be happening, so I tried to stay calm. I focused on my breathing and kept telling myself, wake up, just wake up. Eventually, I snapped out of it. What still freaks me out most is how vivid all of it felt. The objects on the nightstand, the physical touch, the pressure, every part of it felt far too real to be just an ordinary dream. And the repeated false waking, like I kept surfacing only to find myself still inside it, made the whole thing even more unsettling. Honestly, the worst part was that shift, when I realized the person I thought was my husband wasn't him at all. That change from comforting to terrifying happened so fast, and it stayed with me long after I was fully awake. I really think the alarms, the broken sleep, and drifting in and out probably messed with my sleep cycle and dropped me right into something intense. But still, I can't stop thinking about how real it all felt. I want to tell you about the night my granddad Walter passed away, because I still have not been able to fully explain what I felt, and maybe saying it out loud like this will help. For a little background, I am 23, and ever since I was little, I have believed there are things in this world we cannot easily explain. I grew up in a house where strange things happened all the time, especially when I was younger. So for me, the paranormal has never felt impossible. It has always felt real. About a year before he died, my granddad was diagnosed with stage 4 leukemia. He fought hard, truly hard. He went through every treatment he could, held on as long as he could, and kept pushing for more time with us. My family knew the day would come eventually, so we did our best to be there for him as much as possible. When the treatment stopped helping, he was placed on hospice care at my aunt's house. I started taking time off work so I could spend more time there. In his final days, he declined quickly. About 3 days before he passed, he was no longer conscious, and we knew the end was close. On the day he died, I got word that he might only have a few hours left, so I rushed over. I spent most of the afternoon sitting quietly with family, along with the hospice nurse, just waiting. That kind of waiting feels endless. Nobody says much. You just listen to every breath and watch every small change. Sometime around early evening, maybe a little after 5, a close family friend arrived to say goodbye. She had not been able to visit much, so it meant a lot that she came. After a while, she stepped outside with my aunt, and the two of them sat on the porch, talking softly, having a drink and a smoke. Not long after they went outside, I started feeling strange. At first, it was just a headache. Then I got suddenly hot, the kind of heat that makes your skin feel wrong, almost feverish. I remember thinking maybe I was coming down with something. I got up, poured myself some water, and sat back down. but instead of passing, the feeling got worse. The room started to feel heavy. That is the only word that fits. Heavy. Thick. Like the air had changed. My granddad was already making those rattling breaths people talk about at the end, and sitting there, I felt this pressure building in my head and chest. It was so intense that I had to leave the room. I went outside and sat with my aunt and her friend on the porch. The second I stepped out, I started feeling better. Not a little better either. Almost immediate relief. The headache eased, the heat faded, and that crushing heaviness lifted. I told my aunt, "You should probably go back in. He's doing the death rattle." She went inside, and I stayed out there a little longer, trying to settle myself. Once I felt mostly normal again, aside from a faint leftover headache, I went back into the house. And the moment I crossed the doorway, it all hit me again. Full force. Instantly. The headache, the heat, the heaviness, all of it came rushing back. But this time, the whole house felt different. Darker somehow. Off. Not visually dark exactly, just spiritually dark, if that makes sense. The energy in the room had changed. It felt tense and charged, like everything around us knew something sacred and final was happening. One of my aunts had gone out to pick up food earlier, and my dad called her and told her to get back to the house right away. We all knew it was happening then. My dad sent me back outside so I could watch for her and make sure she came in quickly. So I went back out. And again, being outside made me feel normal. I stood there waiting for her car, and while I waited, the strange symptoms faded almost completely. A few minutes later, she finally pulled up. She was moving slowly at first, not realizing how urgent it was, and I hurried her toward the door. But this time, when I went back inside with her, I felt nothing. No headache. No heat. No heaviness. Just stillness. Then my family told me he had taken his last breath right as her car pulled into the driveway. That is the part I cannot stop thinking about. I do not know exactly what happened in that house that night. I cannot prove it was something paranormal, and maybe some people would say it was stress, grief, or my body reacting to the moment. Maybe part of it was. But deep down, it felt like I was sensing something building, something crossing over, something gathering in the room before he let go. And then, the instant he was gone, it was gone too. That is what stays with me. Not just that he died, but that the feeling disappeared the moment he did. Like whatever filled that room left with him. Hello Paranormal M family, and welcome back to the channel. We're so grateful to everyone who has shared their paranormal experiences with us. We truly enjoy telling your stories, and we also love reading your comments, so be sure to leave one below. We hope that every time you visit Paranormal M, you can relax, unwind, and drift off to a peaceful night's sleep. Good night, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. So this happened sometime around 2008, when my girlfriend at the time, I'll call her Maya, and I were both about 19, maybe 20. We were barely out of high school and in a pretty messy phase of life. Because of some rough circumstances, we were staying in this little 2-bedroom house with Maya's dad. Now, her dad was kind of an old burnout, but honestly, he was a decent guy. He had his flaws, sure, but he was doing us a huge favor by letting us crash there while we tried to get our lives together. The three of us probably didn't make the best impression on the neighborhood either. 2 cocky teenagers and one guy who didn't care much about appearances? Yeah, we were definitely that house. The yard was usually a mess. We were loud too late at night. Sometimes the cars were parked where they shouldn't be, and we'd leave the trash bins out way too long. So naturally, there was tension with the woman across the street. She was the kind of neighbor who seemed to notice absolutely everything and always had something to say about it. This was before people were calling someone a Karen, but that was exactly the energy. She and Maya's dad would get into these ridiculous shouting matches across the street, both of them telling the other to mind their business. She had 2 daughters. The older one was a teenager, and the younger one was maybe 6 or 7. The girls themselves were always nice enough. The little one especially loved to talk. Just one of those kids who'd happily tell you every detail of her day, whether you asked or not. And I should mention this happened in Colorado Springs. Anybody who's spent real time there probably knows what I mean when I say that place has a strange vibe sometimes. There's just weirdness there. Strange stories, unsettling moments, stuff you can't quite explain. I grew up around enough of it that this wasn't even the only bizarre thing I could tell you about. Anyway, this happened on a warm summer night, probably sometime in August. It was close to 11, maybe a little later, and the moon was bright enough that the street didn't feel especially dark. Between that and the streetlights, you could see pretty clearly. Maya and I had just gotten back from hanging out with some friends. We were completely sober. No drinking, no drugs, nothing like that. On the way home, we'd been laughing and talking, and because the neighbor lady had apparently irritated Maya's dad earlier that day, we decided to be petty and park right in front of her house. Just immature teenager logic, you know? We got out of the car still joking around, and I was in the middle of talking when Maya suddenly went dead quiet and said my name in this, stop talking right now. I looked at her, and her whole face had changed. Her eyes were wide, and she was staring toward the front of the neighbor's house. She kind of motioned with her hand, and when I turned to look, I saw him. There was a man standing directly in front of one of the front windows. He had his back to us. He was wearing jeans and some kind of long-sleeved dark jacket, and he was just standing there, completely still, staring into the window. We were maybe 10 feet away, not far at all. We had just pulled up in a car, gotten out, and been talking loud enough that anyone nearby should have noticed. But this guy didn't react, not even a little. It was like we weren't there. What made it worse was that we were pretty sure that window belonged to the younger daughter's bedroom. She'd pointed it out to us before, all proud, like little kids do. So the second we saw this grown man standing there staring inside, both of us got this sick feeling. He was still awake. We told him what was going on, and he came out onto the porch to look. Sure enough, the guy was still there. So Maya's dad started yelling across the street. First just, "Hey!" No response. Then louder. "Hey! You hear me?" Still nothing. The guy didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even turn his head. We watched him for another minute or two and finally decided to call the police. Maya's dad wanted no part of dealing with them directly, so he basically washed his hands of it and went back inside. Maya and I called the non-emergency line and explained everything. That there was a man standing outside the neighbor's house, staring into a child's bedroom window, that he'd been there a long time already, and that something felt seriously wrong. The dispatcher told us officers would come by as soon as they could and asked us to keep watch if it was safe. So that's what we did. And the whole time, while we stood on the porch talking out loud about him, describing him, saying the police were on the way, he just stayed there, motionless, like none of it mattered. That's when it started to feel truly wrong. About 10 minutes later, a patrol car turned onto the block. We were still on the phone with dispatch. The cruiser was moving slowly, and they had this bright spotlight sweeping across the fronts of the houses as they came down the street. I remember feeling relieved, like, finally, they're going to see him too. The beam passed over one yard, then another, then finally reached the neighbor's house. It swept over the porch, across the front wall, and landed right where the man was standing. And it stayed on him, for several seconds. We could see his shadow clearly cast against the house. There was no question. The light was on him. He was there. Then, for the first time since we'd noticed him, he moved. Or at least, something moved. His shadow shifted, like he was slowly turning to his left. The spotlight started to drift again, and the instant it moved off him, he was gone. Not running, not ducking, not jumping a fence, not crouching behind a car. Just gone. I know how that sounds. I do. Even now, saying it out loud, it sounds impossible. But both of us saw the same thing. 1 second there was a man standing in front of that window, fully lit up. The next second there was nothing there at all. Maya and I completely lost it on the phone. We were shouting at the dispatcher that the man had just vanished. She kept trying to calm us down and get us to explain, but we barely knew how to describe what we had seen. The police car continued down the block, then circled back later and came to our door. The first thing the officers said was basically, "Can you show us which house?" And that confused us immediately, because we thought they'd already seen him. We told them it was the house directly across from us, the one they'd just shined the spotlight on. They looked at us like, "What are you talking about?" They said they hadn't seen anyone. So we walked back across the street with them and pointed to the exact window. We kept insisting, "You had your light on him, right there, for several seconds." They said they saw nothing at all. Eventually, they knocked on the neighbor's door and spoke to her. Then they came back and told us something that only made the whole thing worse. Apparently, she said it was probably her older daughter's boyfriend messing around, maybe trying to prank somebody. And we were just stunned. Because no. First of all, the man had been staring into the younger child's room. Second, who stands completely motionless outside a house late at night while people yell at him and call the police? And third, how does someone disappear in the middle of a spotlight? But I barely slept that night. Even if the man had just been some creep peeping into a kid's window, that would have been disturbing enough. But the way he vanished, that's the part that stayed with me. It wasn't just creepy. It felt deeply wrong. Like for a few seconds, we had seen something we were never supposed to see. And every now and then, even now, I still bring it up with Maya. I'll ask her if she remembers that night. She always says yes, so at least I know I didn't imagine it. So I live in Chicago, and lately the weather here has been doing that wild winter thing, where bitter, almost Arctic cold swings back and forth with these long, steady snowfalls. One day it's painfully cold, and the next the whole backyard is buried under this smooth, sparkling layer of fresh snow. From our kitchen window, everything looked completely untouched, except for this one narrow path along the fence that my husband Mark keeps shoveled so we can get out to the garage and the alley. The rest of the yard was just this bright, glittering blanket of white, every now and then marked by little animal tracks. And in a city yard, you get all kinds of visitors. We've seen rat tracks, of course, and raccoons too. Sometimes stray cats come through, probably stalking whatever smaller creature was there before them. Every now and then there are rabbits. You start to notice that each one leaves its own kind of signature in the snow. One evening, we were eating dinner when Mark got up to grab something from the kitchen. A second later, he called out to me, all excited. "Hey, come here a second. We've got a rabbit out back." And sure enough, there it was. A big, healthy cottontail, sitting still for just a moment in the middle of all that white, its brown-gray fur standing out so clearly against the snow. It looked right at the house, almost like it knew we were watching, and then it bounded off. When it left, it made those familiar little 4-point rabbit tracks. Not long after that, the snow started coming down harder, and by the time I looked outside again later that evening, those tracks were completely gone. Then, around 9, Mark was back in the kitchen getting snacks while we were settling in to watch a movie. And this time when he called for me, his voice sounded totally different. Not amused, not curious, more like confused, maybe even a little alarmed. He said, "You need to come look at this right now." So I went over to the window, expecting maybe another rabbit. But what I saw was nothing like that. There was this line of prints going straight across the yard, but not in any normal animal pattern. Not paired, not staggered, not clustered. Just one single line, as if something with only 1 foot had crossed the snow by hopping. It started maybe several feet out from the house and continued in a near-perfect straight line toward the garage, which sits well behind the house the way a lot of older garages do in neighborhoods like ours. The prints themselves were surprisingly large, about the size of a grown adult's shoe, maybe around a men's size 10. There was no tread pattern, no sign of a boot sole, nothing like that. And what really got us was this. If a person had somehow made those prints by hopping on 1 foot, there should have been some sign of support. A cane, a crutch, something. But there was nothing. Just these solitary impressions in the snow, one after another, crossing the yard and then ending. That's the part that really stayed with me. It honestly looked as though whatever had made them landed, hopped across our backyard, and then simply vanished. And before anyone says Mark was joking around, absolutely not. For one thing, the prints looked like left foot impressions, and his left knee is in no shape for hopping across a snowy yard. Not even once, let alone over that distance. And as far as we know, there's no one nearby who's missing a leg. So now I'm left wondering, what in the world crossed our yard that night? Because I still can't explain it. And honestly, part of me can't help thinking maybe Chicago has its own strange winter legend lurking around out there in the snow. I still remember the first time I met my son's father's family. We drove out to spend the day with them so everyone could get to know each other, and honestly, it went really well. We ate, talked, laughed a little, and before I knew it, the whole day had slipped by. By evening, his mom asked if we wanted to stay the night, and we did. The next morning, we were all sitting around the dining room table when his sister started talking about something that had happened in the kitchen during the night. For a little context, they were very, very religious, so anything strange or unexplained immediately got labeled as something dark or demonic. She said her youngest had woken up crying, so she got up to warm some milk for him. But when she stepped into the kitchen, she saw this big, hunched shadow filling the doorway near the room where her brother and I were sleeping. She was clearly shaken, and before I could even say anything, she and her mom were already praying over the house and blessing every corner of it. The whole time, I knew exactly what she had seen. And no, I didn't say a word. Because if I had told them the truth, or at least my version of it, they probably would have told him to leave me right then and there. Looking back, that honestly might have saved me a lot of heartbreak, but at the time, I kept quiet. Later, when we got home, I told him I was going out for a walk. What I actually did was make sure I was far enough from the house that nobody would hear me, and then I called out for the thing his sister had seen. I know this is going to sound strange, but I wasn't scared of him. I've had entities around me for most of my life, and this one had been with me for a long time. I used to call him Imri. He was never violent, never threatening, just mischievous, and a little too comfortable startling people. He's small, maybe a foot tall, maybe a little more, but he has these oversized wings that make him look much bigger in shadow than he actually is. Most of the time he'd stay outside, perched in a tree or sitting on a balcony railing, almost like he was keeping watch. So when his sister saw that shape in the dark, what she really saw were his wings. I asked him why he'd scared her like that. And as calmly as anything, he told me, "She doesn't like you." as rude as that sounds, at the time, he wasn't exactly wrong. Eventually, she and I got along much better, and by the end of that relationship, she had actually become someone I cared about. But in those early days, there was definitely tension. And that wasn't the only time someone saw Imri. A lot of my old roommates noticed him too. One night, my best friend's husband got up half awake to check whether there was coffee for the morning. He happened to glance out toward the balcony and saw this tiny figure with huge wings just sitting on the railing outside the second-floor apartment, like it had every right to be there. When I told him who he'd seen, he basically said, "Please tell him to stay outside and stop terrifying people before sunrise." That, of course, only made Imri think it was funny. He loved messing with people who were already tired and on edge, and more than once I had to tell him to knock it off. My best friend saw him too. So did my mother-in-law once, in the hallway of our apartment. Eventually, I made it very clear that if he was going to linger around, he had to stay outside. There just wasn't room inside for that kind of energy, and honestly, he seemed to enjoy the reactions a little too much. Now, Imri is one thing. He's familiar. He's consistent. He's almost part of the background of my life at this point. Those are the little shadows people catch out of the corner of their eye. The ones that dart down hallways, slip around corners, or move low and fast when nobody's expecting it. Sometimes I can tell people it's probably a pet that passed on, just checking in. Sometimes that really does feel true. But other times, I honestly have no idea what they are. Most of the people I've lived with are night owls, and I'm not. I'm out by 9 o'clock most nights, so a lot of the weirdest things happen when I'm asleep. My husband has told me more than once that he's seen shadows moving through the hallway in this apartment and in others we've lived in. The ones shaped like people don't bother him as much. It's the crouched ones that move strangely, the ones that seem almost animal-like, almost like they're creeping along the floor, that really get to him. And I wish I had a good explanation for that, but I don't. Just the other night, my husband and I were playing a video game in the living room when he suddenly said something moved down the hallway toward the bathroom. He told me it wasn't one of the pets. He said it was low to the ground, kind of squatting. He's described that before, but usually after the fact, not while I'm sitting right there beside him. So I turned and looked, hoping maybe this time I'd catch it too and be able to explain it. But I didn't see a thing. At this point, I'm starting to think whatever they are, they just don't want me to see them. And honestly, that's frustrating, because I'm the one everyone turns to when this stuff happens. My brothers have seen them. My best friend and her husband have seen them. My mom has seen them. My mother-in-law has seen them. Enough people have described the same kind of movement, the same weird corner-of-the-eye behavior, that I finally started calling them the creepers, because that's exactly what they do. They creep. Around corners. Along hallways. Just enough to unsettle somebody, never enough to fully reveal themselves. I've even tried staying up late to catch them myself, but my body just refuses. By 9, my brain is done. I'm sure I've seen them before at some point, but if I have, I don't hold on to the memory clearly enough to make sense of it. The strange thing is, I'm not truly afraid they're going to hurt me or my family. That's not the feeling I get from them. Mostly, they're just unsettling and incredibly irritating, especially for the people who have to keep seeing them night after night. I've done cleansings. I've pushed other entities outside. I've tried all the things that usually help. And they're still here. So at this point, all I can really tell the insomniacs in my life is to ignore them as best they can. Which, according to my husband, is a lot easier said than done when something keeps peeking around the hallway multiple times a night. And honestly, I get it. It's annoying for them. And at this point, it's getting pretty annoying for me too. I want to tell you about a story from Causeway Bay in Hong Kong. one that has unsettled people for years. Hidden away in a hotel stairwell, there's said to be an old spirit tablet with the words, "Ownerless Wandering Soul," carved into it. People have whispered for a long time that it was placed there for the restless spirit of a young woman, possibly a singer who died too soon, and that one of her devoted admirers left it behind so she wouldn't be forgotten. No one seems to know the full truth anymore, and maybe that's part of what makes the whole thing feel so eerie. Over the years, plenty of paranormal investigators and curious visitors have gone looking for that tablet. Some claimed they felt a sudden chill the moment they stood near it. Others said they heard strange sounds in the stairwell, or that unsettling things happened to them afterward. Whether you believe those stories or not, the place built a reputation that made people think twice before going near it. Then, in January 2026, everything took a darker turn when a controversial live streamer from mainland China, a man named Yang Deren, decided to visit the site. Unlike the others, he didn't approach it with any sense of caution or respect. He treated the whole thing like a joke. On camera, he laughed about the legend, brushed off the warnings, and mocked the spirit the tablet was meant to honor. At one point, he made remarks to the tablet as though he were speaking to someone invisible, and then, to the shock of many people watching, he took the tablet and stuffed it into his backpack. He even joked that if the spirit wanted to follow him home, that was its own business. To him, it may have seemed like harmless entertainment, just another stunt for views and attention. But for a lot of people, it crossed a line. The backlash was immediate. Many were angry not only because he had removed something believed to be sacred, but because his behavior showed such open contempt for beliefs that still hold deep meaning for many in Hong Kong. And that's where the story becomes even more disturbing. Not long after the incident, rumors began spreading that Yang Deren's life started to unravel. His followers noticed changes in him. He seemed more agitated, more unstable, less like the person they were used to seeing online. His content became stranger, and his public image started to fall apart. Some people dismissed it as stress or coincidence. Others weren't so sure. They wondered whether, by taking the tablet and mocking the spirit attached to it, he had invited something into his life that he didn't understand. In traditional Chinese belief, disturbing a wandering soul is not a small matter. A spirit without proper rites is thought to remain trapped, unable to rest, unable to move on. And if that spirit is provoked or disrespected, the consequences can follow the person responsible. So in the eyes of many, Yang Deren hadn't just stolen an object. He had interfered with something sacred, something already lost and unsettled, and maybe bound that unrest to himself. That's why this story still stays with people. It isn't only about ghosts or curses. It's also about respect, about the things people hold sacred, even when others don't understand them. Maybe what happened afterward was just bad luck. Maybe it was the pressure of public outrage catching up with him. Or maybe, as some still believe, the wandering soul in that stairwell refused to be mocked and forgotten. No one can say for certain. So, let me tell you about one of Hong Kong's most unsettling urban legends. A story that people still whisper about whenever the Ghost Festival comes around. In Hong Kong, the 14th day of the 7th lunar month is known as the Ghost Festival. It's believed that on that day, the gates of the underworld open, and spirits are allowed to return to the world of the living. For a lot of families, it's a time to honor the dead with offerings and prayers. But over the years, that tradition has also become tangled up with some deeply eerie folklore. And one story in particular has stayed with people more than most. Back in 2006, during the Ghost Festival, a woman named Yip Siu Lan, who was in her mid-50s, died after jumping from a high floor of Oi Ming House in Tuen Mun. That alone was heartbreaking. But what made the case so disturbing was the way everything happened. She was dressed completely in red. Red blouse, red trousers, red shoes, even red lipstick and polished nails. It wasn't just clothing, it felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. Before she jumped, she reportedly scattered joss paper along the corridor, like an offering for the afterlife. People said the whole thing felt less like an impulsive act and more like the beginning of something dark. Not long after her death, stories started spreading that she had left messages behind. Some said letters had been sent to building staff and a few residents, warning that her spirit would come back for those who had wronged her. The details changed depending on who told the story, but the threat at the center of it stayed the same. She hadn't left in peace. At first, most people brushed it off. They thought it was just grief, shock, gossip, all the things that happen after a tragedy. But then the strange incidents began. Residents started hearing heavy thuds in the middle of the night, as if someone had fallen from above. People rushed into the hallways expecting to find something, but there was never anything there. Just silence. Then came the stories of footsteps in empty stairwells, whispers in the corridor, and glimpses of a woman in red standing motionless at the far end of the hall before disappearing. And then, only days later, another woman died in a similar way, from nearly the same spot. That's when fear really took hold. People began saying the woman in red had returned. They called her the red-clad ghost, a restless spirit full of grief and fury, unable or unwilling to move on. As more tragedies followed over the next couple of years, the legend only grew stronger. Every new death, every unexplained sound, every claimed sighting seemed to confirm what terrified residents already believed. Some families moved out because they truly thought the place was haunted. Others left because the fear itself had become unbearable. And honestly, once an atmosphere like that settles over a building, every shadow starts to look wrong. Every reflection feels suspicious. Every sound in the night becomes something you can't explain away. That's part of what makes this story so haunting. It isn't only about a ghost. It's about how grief, superstition, and fear can wrap around a community until no one knows where reality ends and legend begins. And then there's the question people always ask. Why red? In Chinese culture, red is powerful. It's tied to life, force, passion, and intensity. But when that same color is connected to death, especially a death filled with pain and resentment, people believe it can give rise to a spirit that is unusually strong. That's why the image of this woman dressed head to toe in crimson stayed burned into people's minds. It felt symbolic, like she had chosen not just how to die, but how to be remembered. Some reports suggested she had been struggling with depression and ongoing distress, possibly worsened by disputes and constant noise in the building. If that's true, then beneath the legend is something deeply sad. A woman who may have felt unheard while she was alive, and whose death became transformed into something larger, darker, and almost mythic. To this day, the tale of the red-clad ghost remains one of Hong Kong's most chilling legends. Maybe it's a ghost story. Maybe it's a tragedy magnified by fear and retelling. Or maybe it's both. Either way, once you've heard it, it's hard to forget the image of that woman in red, standing silently at the end of a corridor, waiting. You know, for as long as people have been telling stories, we've been terrified of the same thing: death. It didn't matter if someone was a king, an emperor, or a mystic hidden away in the mountains. Deep down, they all feared the same ending. And in ancient China, that fear gave rise to one of the darkest obsessions of all: immortality. One of the clearest examples is the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. He didn't see death as a natural end. He saw it as an enemy, something that could be fought, maybe even defeated. He ordered alchemists to make an elixir that would let him live forever, and he sent a Taoist seeker named Xu Feng across the sea to search for the legendary Penglai mountain. But Xu Feng never came back. Some believed he perished on the journey. Others whispered that he found something too strange, too dangerous to ever return with. Either way, the emperor's dream ended the same way all human dreams of physical immortality seem to end, with death. But what's fascinating is that Taoism itself didn't simply let go of the idea of immortality. It changed what immortality meant. At its heart, true Taoist cultivation was never really about keeping the body alive forever. It was about something far deeper, and honestly, a little more haunting. It was about the spirit surviving beyond death. To Taoist practitioners, immortality wasn't about clinging to life. It was about moving beyond both life and death entirely. The body was always temporary. The soul was what endured. And that distinction really matters, because somewhere along the way, people began to twist it. Not everyone who claimed to follow Taoist teachings walked the same road. Throughout history, there were wandering sorcerers and rogue alchemists, often grouped together as Jianghu practitioners, who borrowed Taoist symbols, talismans, and rituals for their own purposes. They promised people incredible things: immortality, protection, supernatural power. But their methods were focused outward. They relied on swallowing strange substances, performing forbidden rites, and trying to control invisible forces. And I think that's what made those practices so tempting. They offered shortcuts. No patience, no inner discipline, no real transformation. Just power, fast and direct. And that's where the story starts to become truly disturbing. There's an idea tied to corrupted Taoist cultivation called the 5 hells to immortality. Even the name feels wrong, doesn't it? Unlike traditional Taoist teachings, this belief claimed that enlightenment could only be reached through unbearable suffering. The path was described as 5 brutal ordeals: freezing cold, consuming fire, the destruction of the body, emotional sacrifice, and forced silence. At first glance, you might think these were symbolic trials, metaphors for spiritual struggle. But if you look at old folklore and scattered historical accounts, it seems some people may have taken them literally. The ice hell came to represent absolute isolation, fear, and abandonment. The fire hell reflected unchecked desire, rage, and emotional torment. The tearing apart of the body symbolized confronting corruption within oneself. The destruction of the heart meant severing emotional attachment. And the silencing of the tongue was said to erase lies, though in some stories, it erased something even worse: identity itself. What makes it even more unsettling is that this whole idea may have grown from a misunderstanding. Traditional Taoism honored the 5 sacred peaks of China, mountains believed to stand between heaven and earth. Pilgrimages to those peaks symbolized harmony with nature, spiritual balance, and elevation of the soul. But over time, because the written characters for peak and hell looked similar enough to stir confusion and myth, some groups may have turned that sacred journey into something darker. A path of ascent became a path of suffering. Pain itself became proof of devotion. And then there's another belief that makes this all feel even more intimate, more unsettling. In Taoist thought, the body already carries its own hidden enemies. Some Taoist texts speak of the 3 corpse spirits, parasitic entities said to live inside every human being. They feed on desire, fear, excess, and weakness. They whisper temptation, chip away at your resolve, and on certain days, they were believed to report your sins to the heavens, shortening your life. Whether you take that literally or as a metaphor, the meaning is powerful. The real obstacle to immortality isn't some demon waiting outside of you. the darkness already living within you. And that, to me, is what makes this legend so haunting. Because true Taoist cultivation teaches restraint, balance, humility, and non-attachment. But when those teachings are misunderstood, or worse, deliberately corrupted, the search for immortality becomes something twisted. It stops being about transcendence and becomes obsession. It stops being about harmony and becomes torment. And that leaves us with a question that's honestly hard to shake. If eternal life really were possible, what would it ask from us in return? Peace? Suffering? Wisdom? Or the loss of everything that makes us who we are? Maybe immortality was never meant to be ours. Maybe the real horror isn't death itself, but the refusal to accept it. And maybe that's the truth hidden inside the legend. The 5 hells were never a road to eternal life. They were a warning. You know, when people think about Hong Kong, they usually picture speed. Crowded streets, bright lights, everyone moving fast, always in a hurry. But the moment death enters the picture, everything changes. The pace slows. People speak more softly. Even the smallest gestures start to matter. And that's why funerals in Hong Kong feel so different. There are certain things people simply do not do. To someone from the outside, those rules might sound like superstition. But for many locals, especially those who've been to enough funerals, they don't feel silly at all. They feel like quiet lines you do not cross, out of respect for the dead and, maybe, for your own safety too. Usually the funeral follows a careful structure. The family chooses a funeral home and decides what kind of service to hold, depending on their beliefs. In Hong Kong, you'll find Taoist, Buddhist, Christian, and Catholic funerals all happening in the same city, sometimes even in the same building. On the day itself, incense is lit, wreaths are placed around the hall, and a priest or ritual master leads the ceremony. The family bows, prayers or sutras are recited, and the person who has died is honored in a very formal, very deliberate way. One of the most striking rituals happens in Taoist funerals. It's called breaking hell. A Taoist priest, dressed in ceremonial robes, uses a peachwood sword and performs a series of symbolic movements, sometimes over flames or shattered tiles. The idea is to help guide the deceased out of the underworld, through its levels of judgment, and make sure they can move on properly. It isn't really meant to scare the living. It's meant to help the dead leave peacefully and not remain behind. Years ago, some families would even stay through the night, keeping vigil beside the deceased until morning. That custom has mostly faded now, but the feeling behind it still lingers. The dead should not be left alone. A lot of these customs go back a long way. In the earlier days of Hong Kong, there weren't formal funeral homes the way there are now. Families sometimes kept bodies temporarily themselves, or burials happened in less organized ways. As the city became more crowded, that became harder and harder, and eventually charitable coffin houses were established. One of the best known was connected to Tung Hua Hospital in the late 19th century. These places gave families somewhere to keep the dead while they arranged burial, cremation, or transport back to an ancestral hometown. Modern funeral homes eventually took over, of course, but even now, they still carry that same atmosphere. Quiet halls, cold air, the smell of incense hanging in the background. A kind of heaviness people feel, even if nobody says it aloud. And then there are the taboos. These are the things people remember most. When mourners give condolence money, it usually ends with the number 1. So instead of a round number, it might be 101 or 501. After that, the family gives back a small white envelope, sometimes with a tissue, a sweet, and a coin inside. Each thing means something. The tissue is for wiping away grief. The sweet is to soften the bitterness. The coin is to restore balance. But here's the important part. You're not supposed to take those things home. You eat the sweet right away. You spend or donate the coin. You use or discard the tissue. Taking any of it home is said to bring misfortune back with you. Some people brush all this off. They say it's old-fashioned, that none of it means anything anymore. But not everyone feels that way. If you ever speak to people who work in the funeral industry, you'll hear stories, usually told quietly, reluctantly. Stories about strange sounds in empty halls, sudden cold patches when no window is open, smells that appear out of nowhere. I once heard an account about a family at a funeral suddenly catching the scent of barbecue pork rice and later realizing it was exactly the smell of the dish sold in the deceased's old cafe. And then there's the story people tell, almost in a whisper. A body was said to have vanished from a coffin during a funeral. The coffin was still there. The offerings were untouched. Nothing else had moved. Everyone panicked. Then someone suggested maybe the deceased did not want to be cremated. So the family knelt and made a promise aloud. And when they looked again, the body had returned. No one ever claimed they could explain it. That's the thing about death in Hong Kong. People don't always talk about it openly. So the silence gets filled with ghost stories, rumors, old warnings, and half-believed truths. Funeral homes become mysterious places in people's minds. Lately, there have been efforts to make death less frightening, with exhibitions and public events meant to help people face it more openly. And maybe that's a good thing. But even so, even people who say they are practical, modern, completely rational, often still follow the funeral rules. Because really, the question has never been whether the taboos are true. It's what happens if, just this once, they are. I want to tell you about an old tradition from the remote, fog-covered mountains of Shaanxi, a custom so eerie and so deeply human that it still feels like something halfway between history and legend. Long ago, when the villages there were isolated and the mountain roads were harsh and unforgiving, people who died far from home often had no easy way to be buried where their ancestors rested. And for many families, that mattered deeply. Home was not just a place for the living. It was where the dead were meant to return. So out of that need, a strange and haunting practice took shape. It was known as corpse escorting, and the men who carried it out were not ordinary travelers or undertakers. They were ritual specialists, men believed to understand both the physical dangers of the mountains and the unseen dangers of the spirit world. You can almost picture it, can't you? A narrow trail winding through the dark, wind slipping through the trees. A figure in a faded indigo robe and straw sandals walking through the night, carrying a small gong and a spirit bell, leading the dead back toward the village they belong to. It sounds like a ghost story, but for generations, people believed it was real. By the late Qing period, this tradition had become especially associated with Taoist ritual practitioners in the Shaanxi region. Families turned to them when someone died far away and needed to be brought back across dangerous terrain. It was not simply transportation. It was considered a sacred responsibility, one that demanded courage, discipline, and ritual knowledge. The preparation of the body was exact. The dead were wrapped carefully, often in dark cloth, and protective charms were placed on or around them. Talismans were used to guard the body and calm the soul. Every step was meant to preserve dignity and keep harmful forces away during the journey. One detail that people still talk about is the way the bodies were said to be moved. According to old accounts, the dead were secured upright with bamboo poles and bound in a line at measured distances from one another. In the darkness, from far away, It might have looked as though they were hopping or walking through the mountain passes themselves. That image, more than anything else, is probably why the tradition became wrapped in so much mystery. Not everyone could be included in such a journey. There were strict rules, shaped by spiritual beliefs and local customs. Only certain deaths were considered suitable for escort. Those who died peacefully were thought to be safer to guide. But people who died violently, dishonorably, or under troubling circumstances were often excluded because their spirits were believed to be restless or dangerous. In some versions of the tradition, women and very young children were also not escorted, tied to old ideas about purity, vulnerability, and the soul's readiness for such a passage. Along the route, the escort might stop at what people sometimes called a corpse inn, hidden resting places tucked away in lonely mountain areas. These were not inns in the ordinary sense. They were sparse shelters, used as temporary stops where the body and its guide could remain until the journey resumed. There, more ritual protections might be performed. The body would stay covered, the charms left in place, and sometimes a local caretaker would help watch over the dead until dawn, or until it was safe to continue. There was often a final soul-guiding ceremony too, where the ritual master helped separate the spirit from the world of the living and direct it toward peace. That mattered deeply. The fear was never just that a body might be lost on the road. It was that a soul might fail to find its way. And that, to me, is what makes this tradition feel so moving beneath all its strangeness. Yes, it is eerie. Yes, it feels supernatural. But at its heart, it came from love, grief, and obligation. Families wanted to bring their people home. Men like the old escorts, perhaps someone like Master Liang instead of the names history forgot, took on that burden and walked into darkness so the dead would not be alone. Today, the practice has nearly vanished. Roads were built, transportation changed, villages became less cut off. The resting inns fell silent, and the ritual knowledge faded with the generations. What remains now is a mixture of memory, folklore, and reverence. But even now, when people speak of corpse escorts in Xiangxi, what lingers is not only fear. It is respect. Because those men were doing more than carrying bodies. They were standing at the threshold between worlds, trying to make sure that even in death, a person could find the way home. Have you ever been to Bride's Pool, tucked away in the northeastern hills of Hong Kong? On the surface, it feels peaceful. There's a quiet waterfall, thick green forest all around, and this strange hush in the air that makes people lower their voices without even realizing it. Most hikers stop there to admire the view and move on. But if you talk to the locals, they'll tell you this place carries an old sadness with it. And once you hear the story, it's hard to look at those waters the same way again. The version I heard begins a long time ago, during the Qing dynasty. There was a young bride named Mei Lin, dressed in a deep crimson wedding robe, being carried toward her marriage in Sha Tao Kok in a traditional sedan chair. The journey should have been joyful, full of ceremony and music. But as the bridal procession came near the waterfall, the weather suddenly turned. Rain came down hard, the path became slick with mud, and the stream swelled with rushing water. One of the bearers lost his footing. In an instant, the chair tipped, and Mei Lin was thrown into the torrent. She tried to fight her way back up, but her robe was heavy, soaked through almost immediately, and it pulled her down. Before anyone could save her, she vanished beneath the water. They searched, but she was never found. And that, people say, is how the place came to be known as Bride's Pool, named for a wedding day that ended before it ever truly began. But like most old stories, it didn't stay in just one form. Over the years, people kept telling it, and each retelling changed something. In one version, Mei Lin never wanted the marriage at all. She was being forced to leave her home and marry someone she did not love. By the time the procession reached the waterfall, her heart was already broken. In that telling, she stepped out on her own, walked calmly to the edge, and disappeared into the pool by choice. Some say her spirit still lingers there at night, dressed in red, standing near the water as though she's still waiting for a ceremony that never came. Then there's another version, softer at first and somehow sadder because of it. In that one, the bride was secretly in love with one of the young men carrying her chair. Her family had promised her to another man, and the two lovers could see no way out. So they made a plan. When the procession reached the falls, he pretended to stumble. The chair toppled, everyone panicked, and it looked as though the bride had been swept away and lost. But according to that version, the two escaped together into the mountains and were never seen again. Some people like to believe they found freedom. Others say their souls never really left the place, and that they still drift through the mist together. What makes the story cling so stubbornly to that place is that it doesn't feel impossible. Before a stone bridge was built there in 1906, people actually had to cross the stream. And if you imagine a woman in a layered bridal gown, traveling in bad weather over wet ground, it's not hard to see how one misstep could turn fatal. That's part of what makes the legend so unsettling. It sounds like folklore, but it also sounds like something that really could have happened. And then, of course, there are the real tragedies that followed. That's when the ghost stories grew louder. Some drivers claim that on wet, foggy nights, they've seen a woman in red standing by the roadside, raising her hand as if asking for help. But when they stop, she's gone. Others say they've heard quiet sobbing near the water, or the faint sound of someone slowly combing long hair, even when no one else is there. And one of the eeriest stories of all comes from people who say they looked into the pool expecting to see their own reflection, only to catch the blurred image of a bride staring back at them instead. Now, maybe it's just folklore layered over grief. Maybe it's the kind of place where one tragedy makes the next feel heavier, until history and rumor become impossible to separate. That happens sometimes. A real sorrow settles somewhere, and over time people give it a face, a name, a color. In this case, a bride in red. Still, if you ever find yourself walking through Plover Cove and you come upon the quiet, misty waters of Bride's Pool, you may feel it too. That strange stillness, that sense that the air is holding on to something old. And for just a moment, with the waterfall murmuring and the trees standing silent around you, it's easy to imagine that somewhere nearby, Mei Lin is still waiting, caught between memory and legend, between the wedding she never reached and the life she never got to live. Do you believe in ghosts? There's a story from Thailand that people still whisper about, even now. It's one of those old tales that never really fades, because it isn't just frightening, it's heartbreaking too. It's about love that refused to let go, even after death. This happened long ago, in the old riverside area of Phra Kanong, on the outskirts of Bangkok. Back then, there lived a young woman named Nalin, and she was deeply devoted to her husband, Mek. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and for them, that was enough. Their life was simple, quiet, and full of hope. When Mek was called away to serve in the war, Nalin stayed behind, carrying their child and counting the days until he would come home. But life can be unbearably cruel. While Mek was still away, Nalin went into labor. It was long and painful, and in the end, neither she nor the baby survived. That should have been the end of her story. But it wasn't. Her love was too strong, or maybe her sorrow was too deep. Somehow, her spirit remained in the house, still waiting, still believing her husband would walk back through that door. And when Mek finally did return, tired and wounded from battle, he found Nalin there, just as he had hoped. She welcomed him home, and for a while, they lived together as if nothing had happened. Mek didn't realize that the woman beside him was no longer among the living. The neighbors knew. Of course they knew. But no one dared tell him. They had seen enough strange things by then, enough to understand that Nalin's spirit had become dangerous. Fear settled over the village. People kept their distance. They lowered their voices, because anyone who tried to reveal the truth was said to suffer for it. As the story goes, Nalin's grief slowly twisted into anger. She could not accept losing the life she was meant to have, and she could not bear the thought of anyone taking Mek away from her again. So the haunting grew darker. The village lived in terror, while Mek remained trapped inside this impossible, ghostly version of home. Eventually, though, the truth found its way to him. Can you imagine that moment? To realize the person you've been eating with, speaking with, sleeping beside, is someone you already lost? The shock of it, the heartbreak, the disbelief. Mek was devastated. Desperate for help, he turned to a respected monk, a man known for wisdom and compassion. In some versions of the story, that monk is said to have had a deep understanding of restless spirits and how to guide them gently toward peace. With the monk's help, Mek finally faced Nalin for what she truly was. And somehow, in that painful moment, everything changed. Her anger began to loosen. The illusion she had been clinging to could no longer hold. She understood at last that her life was over and that the man she loved knew the truth. What makes this story so sad is that Nalin was never just a monster. She was a wife who loved too deeply, a mother who never got to hold her child, a soul caught between longing and loss. And when the ceremony was performed, when prayers were offered and her spirit was urged to let go, she finally released her grief. Before leaving, she is said to have made one last promise to Mek, that their paths would cross again in another life. That's why this legend has stayed alive for so long in Thailand. It isn't only a ghost story. It's a story about devotion, sorrow, and the kind of love that becomes dangerous when it has nowhere to go. People remember Nalin not just because she frightened them, but because they understood her pain. And of course, stories continue. Visitors talk about feeling an eerie stillness near the shrine, or sensing that someone is standing just behind them when no one is there. Some claim they've heard soft crying in the distance, or caught sight of a woman in traditional dress for only a second before she vanished. No one can prove these things, but that's how legends survive, isn't it? Through stories passed from one person to another, each one carrying a little fear, a little wonder. Over the years, this tale has been retold in films, television dramas, books, and stage performances. Each version changes a little, but the heart of it stays the same. A woman who loved so fiercely that even death could not quiet her. And maybe that's why people still remember her. Because beneath all the fear and the ghostly shadows, this is really a story about grief. About what happens when the heart refuses to accept goodbye. So whether you believe in spirits or not, the legend of Nalin lingers for a reason. It reminds us that love can be beautiful. But when it is tangled with loss, it can also become something haunting. Have you ever heard the old Hong Kong story about a flat on Nathan Road where a simple mahjong night turned into something no one could ever explain? If you haven't, let me tell you this one carefully, because even now, it still gives people chills. The story is often called The Four Who Played as Six, though some people tell it a little differently. It's about four friends, one cramped apartment, and two silent figures who should never have been there. It happened in the early 1950s, on a damp spring night, in an aging walk-up building along Nathan Road. Back then, those flats were small and worn, with steep, narrow stairs, peeling walls, and barely enough space to breathe once 4 people sat around a mahjong table. Still, that didn't stop friends from gathering. Mahjong was how people passed the time, especially late into the night. So 4 friends came together that evening. One of them, a man named Ming, had invited the others over for a few rounds. The room was hazy with cigarette smoke, teacups sat near the edge of the table, and the clicking of mahjong tiles rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Outside, the city carried on as usual, but inside that little flat, the world felt closed off, as if the night had sealed them in. At first, everything was normal. Then, in the middle of a round, Ming suddenly stopped moving. He didn't speak right away. He just stared past the others, his face turning pale. Finally, in a shaky voice, he said, "Don't turn around too fast, but I think there's someone standing behind you." Of course, the others thought he was joking. One laughed. Another told him to stop trying to distract everyone. But Ming didn't laugh with them. He just kept staring, frozen in place, like all the warmth had drained out of him. That was when the others slowly turned. And there they were. 2 strangers stood behind the table, quiet as stone. They weren't speaking. They weren't smiling. They were only watching the game, their eyes fixed on the tiles as if they had been standing there all along. The door had been locked. The windows were shut. No one had heard footsteps on the stairs, and yet somehow, in that cramped room, there were now 6 people instead of 4. The friends panicked. Chairs scraped the floor. Someone knocked over a cup. Tiles spilled across the table as all 4 men lunged for the door and rushed down the staircase. They were shouting so loudly that neighbors came out to see what had happened. By the time they reached the street, people were already gathering, looking up at the building, asking what was wrong. The men kept yelling that there were ghosts upstairs. Before long, a crowd had formed on Nathan Road. People from nearby shops and passing trams stopped to stare. Someone called the police, and officers soon arrived to force their way through the growing crowd. They hurried upstairs and entered the flat, expecting to find intruders or pranksters, or at least some explanation. But when they stepped inside, the room was empty. Completely empty. The mahjong table was still there. 4 chairs were still pulled close. The tiles were scattered where the players had left them. Teacups still sat warm on the table. But the 4 friends who had run out screaming were gone. That was the part no one could understand. The men had been seen fleeing the room. People on the street heard them. The police came almost immediately, and yet somehow, when they investigated, it was as if the flat had swallowed the whole night and left only the table behind. In Cantonese, certain mahjong phrases can sound dangerously close to words about death and misfortune. And old players know plenty of taboos. Some believed the arrangement on that table suggested that all 4 friends were doomed the moment the wrong tile was played. Whether that was superstition or something darker, no one could say for sure. After that night, the rumors spread fast. People began gathering outside the building again and again. Some swore they saw shapes moving past the windows when no one lived there. Others said that long after midnight, they could hear the unmistakable sound of mahjong tiles being shuffled, then set down one by one, as if a game were still going on in the dark. A few even claimed they saw 4 figures seated around a table inside, but when they looked closer, the figures seemed to have no heads. Newspapers picked up the story, and that only made things worse. Some writers mocked it, calling it old-fashioned superstition. But in a strange way, that only fed the fear. The more people denied the haunting, the more others became convinced that something truly unnatural had happened in that flat. And no matter who moved in afterward, nobody stayed long. Some left after only a few nights. Some said they felt watched. Some said they woke to the sound of tiles clacking together in the next room, even when the room was empty. and some refused to say anything at all. They just packed up and left. Over time, the story became part of Hong Kong folklore. People tied it to an old mahjong superstition that warns players never to complete a certain pattern involving the west wind, or everyone at the table may go west together. In everyday speech, that can mean dying. So naturally, people began to wonder, did one of the friends make a forbidden move that night? Did they invite something into the room without knowing? No one ever found a solid answer. That's what makes the story linger. It isn't just about ghosts. It's about the blank space where an explanation should be. 4 friends went in. 6 figures were seen. Then somehow, no one was left at all. Today, if you pass that stretch of Nathan Road, you might not notice anything unusual. The building looks ordinary enough. People come and go. Business carries on. Life moves forward, the way it always does in Hong Kong. But if you ask the older locals, some will still lower their voices when they mention that place. And a few will tell you that late at night, if the street is quiet and you stop beneath the old windows long enough, you might hear the faint, dry clatter of mahjong tiles from somewhere above you. As if the players never really left. As if the game is still going on. And maybe, just maybe, there are still 6 at the table. I grew up in Thailand, where stories about spirits and signs from the dead are just part of everyday life. One belief I heard all the time as a kid was about moths, especially big ones that suddenly appear inside the house. People would say that when that happens, it can mean someone who has passed away has come back to visit their family. The way elders explained it was always the same. After someone in the family dies, especially someone very close like a parent or grandparent, a moth might quietly enter the house, settle in one spot, and then vanish without anyone noticing when it left. A lot of people believe that it is the spirit of the person returning for one last visit. I do not know how common that belief is in other places, but in my family, it was something people took seriously. I was raised mostly by my mother and my grandmother. My mom was busy studying and working, so my grandmother, her name was Molly, was really the one who looked after me growing up. We were very close, and for a long time she felt like the center of my world. When I was about 12, our family got the news that she had cancer. Everything changed after that. Her health declined quickly, and less than a year later, she passed away. Before she died, my mother told me about something unsettling that happened one night. She said she heard loud pounding noises coming from inside the walls of the house, like someone was banging hard from the other side. It was so strange that she even asked the neighbors the next day if they had been repairing anything or making noise nearby. They said no one had been home. In Thai folk belief, unexplained banging or crashing sounds in the house can be seen as a bad sign, almost like a warning that someone in the family may soon die. Maybe it was just coincidence, but after my grandmother passed, my mother never forgot it. About 100 days later, we held the memorial ceremony for her. In Thai Buddhist tradition, the 100-day mark is important. It is believed to be a point where the spirit has completed its journey, and the family makes merit, invites monks to chant, and offers blessings in memory of the person who died. That day, our house was packed with relatives. I remember standing downstairs, feeling a little lost and overwhelmed by all the noise and movement. I was still young, and I do not think I fully understood the weight of what the day meant. Then suddenly, I heard people upstairs speaking in anxious voices. And right at that moment, in the middle of the afternoon, a large moth flew into the house. It came straight toward me and landed gently on my dress. It just sat there, completely still. I panicked and shook it off. The moth fluttered down and settled on a stack of folded towels near the staircase. Then it stayed there without moving. My mother saw it and immediately froze. I still remember the look on her face. She quietly went to shut the doors and windows, and for a long time, she just stood there watching it. Other relatives gathered around too, but no one wanted to touch it. It remained there for more than an hour, calm and motionless, as if it belonged there. Then, sometime later, when everyone's attention drifted back to the ceremony, it was gone. No one saw it leave. My mother and several relatives were convinced that the moth was my grandmother, that she had returned to see us one last time on the 100th day after her death. Maybe it was nothing more than chance. I cannot say for sure. But there was one more thing that happened that day, and honestly, it still gives me chills. Those voices I heard upstairs belonged to some family friends who were trying to calm my little cousin. She was only a toddler at the time. Out of nowhere, she pointed behind the adults in the room and said, "Grandma, Grandma is here." Then she said it again. My grandmother had helped care for her too, before she became too sick. So hearing those words from such a small child frightened everyone. Even now, I still do not know what to believe. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe, just maybe, my grandmother really did come back to see us one last time. So, we really believed a quick trip out of the city would make everything better. Me, Ravon, Samir, Annika, and Priya were all exhausted, completely drained from the traffic, the heat, the noise, and that dull feeling of living the same day over and over again. So when Ravon found this ridiculously cheap guest house in a quiet little hill town, it felt like exactly what we needed. The pictures online showed a charming old place with fresh paint, warm lights, and simple but comfortable rooms. Honestly, the low price should have warned us. But we wanted an escape, so we ignored the feeling. By the time we got there, the sun was already going down, and the place looked wrong. It wasn't charming. It wasn't cozy. The walls were stained and peeling. The windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, and the whole place felt colder than the evening air should have allowed. Out front, hanging at an angle, was an old wooden sign that read, "Hollow Lane Guest House." I still remember the caretaker. He stepped out so quietly it startled us. Tall, bony, hollow-faced. He didn't greet us, didn't smile, didn't ask about our trip. He just handed over the room keys and said, in this flat, careful voice, "Your rooms are upstairs. Don't walk around after midnight." We laughed. I wish we hadn't. That first night, the silence was the worst part. There were no crickets, no wind, no distant cars, nothing. Just the old house settling now and then, the floorboards giving these slow little creaks like someone shifting their weight somewhere nearby. I woke sometime around midnight. At first I thought I was dreaming because I could hear whispering in the hallway. Soft, uneven, almost like several people speaking at once. Then it got louder, more urgent. Some voices sounded angry, some sounded terrified. And then I realized, this is the part I still can't explain. They were saying our names. Samir kept insisting it was just the pipes or the wind or maybe people outside. But there was no wind. And when I looked at Annika and Priya, both of them looked just as shaken as I felt. The next morning, we tried to act normal. We even joked about it over breakfast, like saying it out loud would make it less real. Later, while wandering around the back of the house, we found this old locked door near the kitchen. The wood around it was scarred with long, deep scratch marks, like someone had clawed at it from the other side. Priya stepped back immediately. Ravon tried to laugh it off and called it an old pantry or storage closet. But none of us really believed that. The second night was worse. At exactly 1 in the morning, the whole house changed. Not gradually, instantly, like something had been waiting for that exact moment. Doors started slamming somewhere upstairs. Heavy footsteps moved across the ceiling even though there was no floor above us. The air turned freezing. Then, at the far end of the hallway, I saw someone standing there. Or something. It was thin and pale, with wet hair hanging over its face. I couldn't make out its features properly, except for these dim, reddish eyes glowing underneath the strands. It didn't walk toward us. It sort of glided, slowly, almost gently. And then it spoke. Very softly. Leave. Now. That was enough. And then, just like that, morning came. Sunlight spilled through the dirty windows. The voices stopped. The cold lifted. The front door slowly creaked open on its own. We didn't pack. We didn't speak. We just ran. We left that town without looking back. Later, before we caught the bus home, Priya spoke to an old woman from the village. The woman listened quietly, then leaned closer and said, "That guest house has stood empty for many, many years. It remembers the people who enter. Some come back different. Some never come back at all." We returned to the city, and on the surface, life carried on. Work, traffic, messages, meetings, all of it. But some nights I still wake up shivering, even in warm weather, because I hear someone whisper my name from the darkness beside my bed. And every time that happens, I think of Hollow Lane Guest House. Still standing. Still waiting. And sometimes I wonder if that warning came in time, or if that place has already followed us home. So, my younger brother Mason and I used to cut through the cemetery on the way home. It shaved maybe 15 minutes off the walk from school and work, and after a long day, that felt worth it. Mason loved messing with me. That was just who he was. He knew creepy places got under my skin, so of course he thought it was funny to act like nothing ever bothered him. Anyway, one evening we got off work earlier than usual, and the sun was still hanging low, not quite gone yet. It was the end of August, the kind of time when the air is usually still warm even after sunset. But the second we got near the trees by the cemetery, everything changed. I got this sharp chill all over me. Not just cold exactly, more like the whole place felt wrong. Mason was smacking his gum, loud as ever, and he just laughed and said, "Don't start. We walk through here all the time. It's just dirt and headstones." I didn't argue. I just lit a cigarette and kept walking behind him. Then I heard this awful sound. Wet, panicked, choking. I looked up and it was Mason. I ran to him right away. He was bent over, grabbing at his throat, and I started hitting him between the shoulders as hard as I could. Once, twice, over and over. It felt like forever, even though it was probably only a minute or two. Finally, he coughed up the gum. Later, he said he must have stepped into a dip in the ground, lost his footing, and sucked in air so fast it pulled the gum straight into his throat. The second he spat it out and caught his breath, I looked up. And that's when I saw it. There was something out over the graves. I still can't explain it well. It could have been smoke drifting weird from my cigarette. It could have been a person standing farther off. Maybe even some animal moving through the markers. But in that moment, it looked like a shape just hovering there, not quite solid, not quite real. And I can tell you this, every hair on the back of my neck stood up. Mason said later he felt something too. He admitted the air had turned unnaturally cold, but he blamed all of it on choking and freaking himself out. We got out of there fast after that. Neither of us said much. Then, as we were leaving, I noticed one more thing. There was this little orange cat sitting on top of a grave. She was perfectly still, just watching us pass by. She didn't run, didn't meow, didn't even blink much. Just sat there like she belonged in that place more than we ever could. That scared me more than the figure did, honestly. We went home, and after that, neither of us really talked about it. A few days later, I started asking around without making it sound like I was spooked. Just casual questions. Neighbors, friends, anybody who lived near the cemetery. One older man whose backyard backed right up to the fence told me there'd been an orange cat hanging around that cemetery for as long as he could remember. He even showed me an old photo once. And I swear, it looked exactly like the one I saw that night. Same small body, same bright coat, same stare. But here's the strange part. One of the groundskeepers said there was no cemetery cat. Said nobody fed one, nobody kept one there, and he'd never seen any orange cat living on the property. Mason still won't really talk about that night. He says he was choking. He wasn't paying attention to anything around us, and he never saw a cat at all. Maybe he's right. Maybe I was rattled and my mind filled in the blanks. But I still remember how cold it got. I still remember that shape over the graves. I've actually had something like this happen to me, and I still think about it sometimes. It was in 2013, and I was about 11 years old. My family and I had spent several weeks in Slovakia for the summer, and the day we were meant to fly back to England, we had a ridiculously early flight, around 6:30 in the morning. So, of course, my dad woke me up somewhere around 3 a.m. because, parents always want to get to the airport hours before they need to. I remember being half asleep, just dragging myself out of bed, pulling on my clothes, and going downstairs to brush my teeth. Everything felt quiet and heavy, like that strange stillness you only get in the middle of the night. Once we were all ready, we loaded the suitcases into the car, and I climbed into the back seat. Before we drove off, I remember looking back at the house. It was completely dark outside, and I was just sitting there thinking about how much fun I'd had during the holiday. Then I looked up toward the top balcony and saw this little orange glow, like the end of a lit cigarette. At first, I didn't think anything weird about it. Most of my family smoked back then, so I figured someone must have left one burning. I pointed it out to my dad, and he saw it too. He got annoyed straight away, muttering under his breath, and hurried back inside to put it out. The rest of us stayed in the car while we waited for him. And I kept staring up at that balcony. That's when I saw the glow lift up, just slightly, like someone had picked up the cigarette. Then it brightened for a second, like someone had taken a drag, and after that, it lowered again. A moment later, I saw my dad's phone light appear inside the room. He moved through the darkness, reached the balcony area, and then the glow disappeared. Then he came back out to the car. For a second, I tried to convince myself maybe it had been my dad all along. Maybe he'd picked it up before putting it out. But the timing didn't make sense. I had seen the cigarette being smoked before his light even appeared in the room. And that's the part that's always stayed with me. It felt like someone, or something, had been standing up there. Later on, I told my cousin Mila about it. She's only a few years older than me, and she went quiet straight away. Then she said she'd seen something strange there too. Her story happened when they were leaving the house one morning for the airport as well. Only their flight was later, so it was already getting light outside. As they were driving away, she happened to look up toward that same top balcony and saw a figure standing there. She said it raised its arm and gave this slow, deliberate wave. She told me the shape looked wrong somehow. Not clear enough to make out properly, but dark, still, and watching. What really stayed with her was the feeling. She said it felt like it was staring directly at her. like she could feel its eyes following the car as they pulled away. And then there's the last story, the one from my granddad, which somehow makes it all even stranger because he's the least nervous person in the family. He's never been scared of that house. In fact, he always says if anything is there, it should be afraid of him. One afternoon, everyone else had gone out, and he was home on his own, cutting the grass with one of those loud handheld mowers. If you've ever used one, you know they make such a racket that you can barely hear yourself think. He said that while he was mowing, he glanced up toward the same balcony and saw the curtain shift. Just slightly. And behind it, he saw what looked like a dark hand, like someone was pulling the fabric aside to peek out at him. He turned instinctively, really fast, and at that exact moment, the mower struck a stone and sent it flying past where his face had been a second earlier. If he hadn't turned when he did, it could have hit him straight on. He always said whatever spoke to him had warned him. My granddad does believe the house is haunted, in his own way, but he's never been bothered by it. He built that house himself. He bought the land, laid the foundations, and made it into a home. So he just shrugs and says that if there is something there, then it's the guest, not him. And honestly, the way he says it is so matter-of-fact that it almost makes you feel better. Almost. I want to tell you about something strange that happened to me, my sister, and her boyfriend one New Year's Day a few years ago. It was January 1st, 2019, and honestly, the day started exactly the way you'd expect after New Year's Eve. I was wrecked. Hungover, exhausted, anxious, that whole miserable combination. To make it worse, one of my friends and I had made the brilliant decision to walk home from a party in the middle of the night instead of just sleeping there. It wasn't a quick walk either. We ended up stumbling almost 7 kilometers in the freezing cold, completely drunk, and it took forever. At the time, it felt hilarious and adventurous. The next morning, not so much. So, I'm back at my parents' house, lying in my old room, half asleep, still feeling like my body's been hit by a truck. Then I hear this soft little whining sound. At first, I'm confused, just trying to figure out where I am. I look down beside the bed, and there's our family dog, Alvin, staring up at me like, "Come on, get up." He needed to go outside. I'd forgotten my parents weren't home, and my sister was out too, so it was on me. I dragged myself out of bed, threw on some clothes, and took him out. And let me tell you, standing up fast when you're that hungover is brutal. But once I got moving, it helped a little. It was one of those classic Swedish winter mornings on the West Coast. Bitter wind, icy ground, gray sky, that damp cold that gets through everything. The thermometer didn't look that bad, but the wind made it feel way colder. My face was numb in seconds. Still, there was something nice about being out there with Alvin. He was this small, shaggy little poolie, full of personality, and even in that miserable state, I remember thinking how good it felt to have him trotting beside me. When we came back inside, he was in one of those playful moods, totally fired up. I started messing around with him, hyping him up even more, and we had one of those silly little play fights we always used to have. He loved that. I loved it too. I still miss him so much when I think about moments like that. After a while, I gave him a chew bone, and once he settled down, I went back to bed. Now, the layout of the house matters here. My room was right near the hallway, and across from it, a little off to the side, was my old bedroom, the one my sister and her boyfriend were using at the time while they were between apartments. I fell asleep again and didn't wake up until around noon. I got up, made coffee, fixed something to eat, and sat down in the living room with the TV on. The house had a really open layout, so from the living room, you could pretty much see everything except the hallway and the bathrooms tucked back there. And that hallway, I've never liked it. Even in daylight, it always gave me this awful feeling. Like if you walked between the living room and the hall, you could feel something behind you. Not just the sense of being watched, but the feeling of someone being right there, just over your shoulder, close enough that the back of your neck would prickle, it always made my whole body tense up. Anyway, back to that day. Alvin came over while I was eating and gave me that look dogs have when they know exactly how to manipulate you. So of course I gave him a little piece of my sandwich. Then I let him out on the lawn for a bit, brought him back in, and spent most of the afternoon just lying on the couch recovering. Later that evening, my sister and her boyfriend came home. It was already dark by then, which is completely normal in Sweden that time of year. In winter, it feels like the sun barely shows itself before disappearing again. The mood in the house was actually really nice. My sister and I fought constantly growing up. We could argue over absolutely anything. We knew exactly how to get under each other's skin. But around that time, things had started to soften between us. We were finally acting more like adults and less like enemies pretending to be siblings. She was pregnant then, very early on, with their first child. She told us the news just a little before that, so she wasn't drinking. But her boyfriend and I each had a beer, and we all sat on the couch together with Alvin. He always wanted to be wherever everyone else was. If he wasn't up on the couch with us, he'd disappear against the black, shaggy rug because he was just as dark and scruffy as the carpet. You had to be careful not to step on him. We watched a movie, talked a bit, just had one of those quiet, cozy evenings that feel especially good after the chaos of a holiday. By around 10:30 or 11, we were all tired enough to call it a night. I remember feeling relieved, actually, because I always slept easier in that house when I knew other people were there. So we all brushed our teeth, said goodnight, and went to our rooms. I put on some random YouTube video like I used to do when I wanted background noise while falling asleep. I wasn't fully asleep yet when I heard it. Footsteps coming up the stairs to the front door. Then the sound of the front door opening, then closing again. Then someone walking inside. Alvin exploded into barking and ran straight toward the hallway like he always did when someone came in. But then, suddenly, he stopped. And the silence after that. I still remember it. It was horrible. Thick. Heavy. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat and feel cold spreading through your whole body. I knew my parents were away. They were abroad and weren't due back for another couple of days. So right away I was confused and then scared. I could hear my sister and her boyfriend moving too. They'd heard it. But almost immediately I got this feeling, deep in my gut, that whatever had come in wasn't a person. I know how that sounds, but it was the exact same feeling I used to get in that hallway when I was younger. This dark, angry, overwhelming sense that I was not supposed to step out there. My whole body reacted at once. My throat tightened, my shoulders locked up, my stomach dropped. I could feel adrenaline just flooding through me. At the same time, I was thinking, what if it is a real person? What if someone's broken in? I couldn't just stay in my room and let my sister's boyfriend deal with that alone. And then I thought about Alvin. What if someone hurt him? That was enough. At the exact same moment, my sister's boyfriend and I opened our bedroom doors and looked out. We just stared at each other for a second, both of us with the same expression. And honestly, it would have been funny if it hadn't been so tense. Like something out of a cartoon. I checked Alvin first and saw that he was okay, just confused, standing there staring toward the hall. I asked, "Was that you?" He said, "No, I thought it was you." It was freezing. Proper January cold. Dark as pitch outside, except for the weak outdoor lights and the stars overhead. In front of the house, there was a garage straight ahead, a paved area leading to it, parking off to one side, and the big fenced lawn on the other side with bushes separating everything. There weren't many places someone could hide without us seeing them. We checked everywhere. The driveway, around the garage, by the bushes, the yard. Nothing. No person. No movement. no sound. And what struck me was how fast we'd gotten outside. Whoever we heard would have had only seconds to vanish, and there was nowhere obvious for them to go. We just stood there looking at each other, trying to make sense of it. I remember saying something like, "What just happened? We both heard someone come in." And he said, "There has to be some explanation. There just has to be." My sister came out too and asked what was going on, and we all ended up standing there talking in the cold, trying to come up with anything logical. Maybe the door hadn't latched right. Maybe the wind caught it. Maybe we imagined part of it. But the thing is, it didn't feel like imagination. We heard footsteps. We heard the door. Alvin reacted exactly the way he always did when someone came home, right up until the moment he reached the hallway and went silent. And this wasn't even the first time something like that had happened in that house. Later on, my parents told us they'd experienced the same thing more than once. One of them would be in the kitchen, hear someone come in through the front door, call out thinking the other had arrived home early, and get no answer. Alvin would run toward the hallway barking, then go quiet. And when they checked, nobody was there. I still don't have a clean explanation for it. If it had only happened once, I'd probably chalk it up to a mistake, bad acoustics, a loose door, something like that. But hearing that it had happened several times to different people in the house made it much harder to brush off. What's strange is that it seems to have stopped since my parents replaced the old front door with a newer one that locks automatically. I haven't heard any new stories about the footsteps in a long time, but that night stuck with me. Not just because it was creepy, but because all three of us heard it. It wasn't just a dream, and it wasn't just me being paranoid in that old hallway. To this day, when I think about that house, I still remember that feeling. The footsteps, Alvin barking, the silence right after. That part is what gets me the most.